issues of environment and climate change and preservation is something that Jim Fitch really pioneered in talking about decades ago. He understood that these were really important issues in the history of architecture and in the reasons why we wanted to do preservation. And so it was here at Columbia that he really thought about a lot of those issues about climate change and the environment. So having this conference here with the spirit of Jim Fitch around us, I think is really, really important and really crucial to an understanding of a lot of these issues. So I don't want to take up too much time. I know that there's a really, really tight schedule today. So I'm going to just welcome everybody and take advantage of whatever facilities we have. And I'm going to turn it over to Charles Platt.
I am Charles Platt, in fact. I'm an architect and partner at Platt, Beyer, Dovell, White Architects. I'm also on the board of trustees and have been for a long, long time of the Municipal Art Society and the co-chair of the Municipal Art Society's Preservation Committee. On behalf of Vince Cipolla, the president of MAS and the board of trustees, I would like to welcome you to the Conference on Preservation and Climate Change in New York City. As many of you, it says here actually, most of you know, the Municipal Art Society is a civic organization that fights for intelligent urban design, planning, and preservation through education, dialogue, and advocacy. Today's program is a continuation of our long-standing effort to make our city a more livable place. Since our founding in 1893, we have brought New Yorkers together to shape their city. Doing so has placed us at the forefront of some of New York City's, some of the nation's, in fact, most significant land use and preservation issues. The Municipal Art Society successfully fought for a Landmarks Preservation Commission, a City Planning Commission, the implementation of the nation's first zoning laws, and of course, the constitutionality of the city's landmarks law itself. These successes, and they have been successes, and others stem from our tradition of linking New York City's livability to how we regulate the built environment and how we manage growth in a city to allow for increased density while preserving our historic buildings and neighborhoods. Today, with the urgent need to tackle climate change, the Municipal Art Society is increasingly looking at how we can make our planning and preservation practices work better with environmental issues. For the preservation community, the challenge is threefold. One, we need to better understand how preservation regulations and green building standards can be designed so that the goals of both can be achieved. Two, we need to find and promote the common ground between preservation and sustainability. And three, the preservation community needs to be engaged and be at the table as new sustainability policies are developed. I would now introduce Lisa Kersavage, the Senior Director of Preservation and Sustainability at the Municipal Art Society. There's a long resume here. I've put it to music, and I'm about to sing it all. So.
Thank you for sparing everybody of that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm going to grab a water. I know it's early, and I appreciate you all being here so early. I think this is a really important issue. I think it's one of the most critical issues facing the city, and I think also facing the preservation field. I'm going to talk a little bit about the MAS campaign for preservation and climate change. The goal of that campaign is to promote the positive environmental benefits of retaining and improve the efficiency of New York City's older and landmark buildings. This campaign really grew out of some concerns, especially during the boom time in New York City. We were seeing a lot of demolition, a lot of dramatic changes to communities, and some of it was done under the guise of environmentalism, and we were never quite sure whether it was always good for the environment or not, and where preservation might fit in. So what MAS has done is actually tried to find common ground with a number of different goals. We hosted 8 roundtables last winter and spring with a series of interdisciplinary experts to try and find where are the common ground between this whole array of issues. And I'm going to show you some of the analysis that we did, some of the mapping that we shared with the roundtable participants, and then some of the goals that came out of those roundtables. But just as a bit of background, for me personally, I became very interested in this issue through working on trying to preserve some of the industrial heritage of the Brooklyn waterfront. The National Trust listed it as one of the most endangered sites in 2006. We were just seeing a lot of demolition of these really substantial and eminently reusable buildings. Just one example was the old Dutch Muster building in Williamsburg. When the city rezoned this area, they didn't really take into consideration the existing historic buildings that had, for the last 50 years been used for manufacturing or reused for loft and living spaces, and really created the vitality and excitement of Williamsburg. This building in particular really grabbed me because it's a relatively handsome older building, and the developer had planned to just retrofit and reuse this building, but after the rezoning, he said it behooved him to demolish and build new. And it was a building that they created that wasn't really all that much bigger than the existing one. And we just started to think, is this really good for the environment? How can we start to create policies that preserve more of our existing fabric? Plan YC2 was also an impetus for us. I think nationally, when you look at Plan YC, it's an incredible achievement, and it's a critically important document. But I think that the preservation community has found that it hasn't necessarily incorporated the goals of preservation. And I think we have this wonderful opportunity with Plan YC being rewritten to get more of the preservation into this plan. So the conference today is divided into 4 themes. The first one is Adapt, really looking at how we can start planning today for the impacts of climate change. We have a wonderful panel on this today. MAS has done some mapping showing we overlaid hurricane evacuation zones with historic landmarks and districts. And there's quite a lot of overlap, especially in places like Coney Island, a bit in the Rockaways, Brooklyn near the Gowanus Canal. So these are areas that certainly with the increased storms that we'll see, we definitely need to start considering how do we adapt to these increased weather events that we'll be seeing. And we also need to ensure that preservation and cultural resources get incorporated into the city's disaster plans. The city has incredibly robust disaster plans for saving lives and providing housing, but none of those plans include any mention of cultural resources. Improve is the next theme of the conference. And the goal here is improving the efficiency of historic buildings in New York City without compromising their character. What's critical in New York City is that 77% of the city's GHG emissions are from the construction and operation of buildings. So any strategy to tackle climate change has to include buildings, and it's critical that we address this. What we found is that there's potentially not as much conflict as one would imagine in improving the efficiency of our historic buildings, and we just need to ensure that the guidelines incorporate the best of both goals. And New York City has a relatively old building stock. We mapped the age of buildings. This is not highly accurate, but we think good enough for trends. We found that about 56% of New York City's buildings are old. They were built before 1940. So while we try to improve the efficiency of our existing buildings, we really have to pay attention to the old ones. And I think the preservation community has a lot to provide in working with that age of building stock. And I think the preservation community needs to become advocates for improving energy efficiency. I think this will help us align with the green building and sustainability movements, and we can find the ways to improve the efficiency without compromising the character. We also need to develop guidelines and case studies that can show how to do that. In terms of standards, green building standards, there's a huge array. We have a fabulous panel on this today, so I'm not going to go into any great detail. But we need to understand how preservation works with this growing number of standards, from LEED to the EPA's Homestar to the city's Greener Greater Building Plan to Passive House. How does preservation fit in? And I think it's important that we consider the small buildings in all of this too. The city's focus has been on the big buildings, over 50,000 square feet, because it's the biggest chunk of energy, so it makes sense. But I think preservation has something to contribute with the smaller buildings, which still contribute 32% of the city's GHG emissions, or energy use, excuse me. Measure. We're going to have a panel today about how we can measure things like life cycle analysis, looking at whether it's better to, or what is the energy impact of demolishing and building new versus keeping buildings and improving them. Windows are always an important issue to preservationists. We need to develop metrics about retaining buildings versus new ones, and demolition. We're not going to talk a lot about demolition today, but this is something that MAS is going to be working on. 60% of New York City's waste stream is construction and demolition debris. And we need to figure out ways to reduce that environmental impact, especially because we don't have a landfill in New York. We truck, for the most part, sometimes barge all of our waste to distant states. So there is an enormous environmental impact of this. And during the boom, there was a lot of demolition. We mapped demolition permits between 2003 and 2008. And this is a fascinating map. If people want to get a copy of it, I'm happy to give it to you to see where the demolition permits were issued. We don't know if all of these permits were acted on, but we, in doing some studies, have found that most of them actually were. But the numbers are pretty shocking. Between 2003 and 2008, 16,520 demolition permits were issued. So that's about 2% of the city's building stock. And just to put that in perspective, 3% of the city's building stock is designated as either a landmark or a historic district. Manage. We look at how we can achieve higher population density while preserving our relatively low density historic districts. Again, looking at change, we mapped new building permits, again, during the boom, 2003 to 2008. And we found that there was about 300 million square foot increase to the city during that time. So while there was a lot of demolition, the good news is that we actually did increase density, which is good. It's a greener city to have higher density. Another issue preservation is going to have to start making arguments about is looking at density in the city. In terms of the built density, which is the floor area ratio we mapped here, you can see the density of the actual buildings. The darker colors are denser buildings, bigger buildings. The lighter colors are lower. But if you look at population density, you can see that it actually doesn't always correlate to have the bigger building with more population. Brooklyn has a relatively low building stock but high population density. So MAS is going to continue to do analysis on these kinds of density issues. So the next steps. MAS is going to be writing a white paper, carefully listening today during the conference to help inform this white paper, also from the roundtables on these issues. We also are very proud that we just received a grant from the J.M. Kaplan Fund to do an actual demonstration project on a small landmark building. So we're going to be trying to find a nonprofit owner of a building that's less than 50,000 square feet, and we're going to actually do the retrofit and share all the findings so we can start to build the case studies. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm going to ask Frank Sanchez to come up to introduce our keynote speaker. Oh, I should say these are our funders. I'm just going to open up her PowerPoint.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lisa, for that very articulate introduction to today's program. I'm amazed at how immersed you have become in this subject, and am very impressed by it, since I don't happen to know what a GHG is. So it's clearly significant that I'm here today, and I hope to learn something. I'm Frank Sanchez. I'm the former executive director of the Municipal Arts Society, currently senior advisor, and it's my great pleasure to be here today to introduce Emily Wadhams, our keynote speaker. Emily, in 2003, was appointed as Vice President for Public Policy at the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Washington. And in that capacity, she oversees all aspects of the Trust's congressional, federal, state, and local policy. And I saw in her write-up that Emily is a graduate of the Historic Preservation Program at the University of Vermont, but I don't see anything in there about a law degree. Are you a lawyer? And I think it's absolutely wonderful that the director of preservation policy at the National Trust happens not to be a lawyer, so good for them. She also directs the National Trust Sustainability Program, which includes something that I had never seen or heard of, which is the National Trust Seattle-based Preservation Green Lab. Emily was the State Historic Preservation Officer of the state of Vermont from 1998 to 2003, and at that time, more or less simultaneously, she was an advisor to the National Trust. No, I'm not finished yet. I should say that currently she serves on the Board of Directors of the Preservation Trust of Vermont and also of Smart Growth America. She represented the National Trust at the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation's Sustainability Task Force. Emily also has a lot of hands-on experience, which I think is very germane to this conference, and which you can see in her expanded bio in the program. I just want to say that it's always been one of my great disappointments that my tenure at the National Trust ended in 1999, just when Emily came on as an advisor. And I guess to some very small degree that disappointment is mitigated today by this opportunity to listen to what she has to say about this subject. Thank you, Emily, for being with us.
Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me? Thanks for struggling here so early in the morning. I appreciate it. Some of us had a little bit of a hard time finding the building, but those of you who made it, that's wonderful. I'm going to reiterate some of the points that Charles and Lisa made. I think we all have the same message here this morning. But first, I have a couple of questions for you, just sort of to gauge the audience. How many of you have heard of the National Trust for Historic Preservation? Yay! How many of you think we're a bank? How many of you think we're affiliated with the federal government? Yay! This is great. Most audiences have not a real clear idea of who we are, but we are a 501c3 nonprofit membership organization. We have 9 regional offices around the country. We work with a network of partners like MAS here in New York, as well as the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and our statewide partner is the Preservation League of New York. Is there anybody here that's part of the Preservation League of New York? We have a regional office in Boston, run by Wendy Nicholas. We work on a variety of issues. We have an annual conference. We do our 11 most endangered. We do a dozen distinctive destinations. We do the National Main Street program. We do have a law department, Frank, so we have a lot of lawyers. But I'd also like to introduce 2 people who are here today who will speak later, and I'm not going to talk about their areas of expertise in much detail today, but Patrice Fry, who's here, and she is the Deputy Director of the Sustainability Program at the National Trust, and Liz Dunn, who runs our Seattle-based Preservation Green Lab, which is just a little over a year and a half old, which is doing great work in this area. And Frank, if you stick around, by the end of the day, you're going to know what greenhouse gas emissions are, and you need to learn. Our policy initiative has been focused primarily on, our sustainability initiative has been focused on policy change, because we saw a tremendous amount of policy change happening all over the country around the issues of climate change. And I'm going to be a little controversial here. I think that the historic preservation movement right now is in serious trouble. I think we're at a low point in our history. And we are not engaging appropriately in the issues of our day, specifically climate change, environmentalism, and even jobs. So our goal has been to draw the lines between historic preservation and sustainable development and climate change and job creation, and to do the research, to make the case, and to try to get the message out. Most people perceive preservation, or a lot of people perceive it as being about old iconic buildings, that old buildings are energy hogs, and that we're all about the past. We all know in this room, because you're all connected in some way to historic preservation, that it is really a key to a better future. But that message has not really reached a lot of the general public. We feel that the deck is often stacked against older and historic buildings. With apologies to the architects here today, because there are some great architects that this doesn't apply to, but many of them prefer to start with their own design and not have to work with somebody else's. Also, our whole economic, the way we measure the success of our economy is based on new housing starts. And then finally, the economics of reuse. There's a perception that it's much harder and sometimes more expensive to reuse a historic building. It's easier to demolish it and start new on the site, or to start on a greenfield site somewhere. Also, the environmental community is not really all that focused on building reuse either. And we talk about this as the Lisa Ling effect. Do any of you know who Lisa Ling is? She's a journalist. She used to be a co-host of a program called The View. She's been a correspondent for Oprah. She was the host of National Geographic Explorer. And Lisa Ling and her husband owned an older home in Los Angeles, and last year they demolished it to make way for this brand new LEED Platinum certified home. And Lisa Ling talks passionately about the environmental degradation that she's seen around the world in her reporting career. But what she doesn't get is this direct connection between the consumption of natural resources when you build a platinum house like this and environmental degradation. I don't mean to vilify her, but I think her attitude typifies the problem that we face. That in this country, the green movement is based on an assumption of consumption, when we really need to start with the assumption that we can't build or consume our way out of this climate crisis, but to get through it, we need to pay much, much more attention to conservation and building reuse. And Lisa Ling isn't alone. I mean, just going to throw these statistics up. In New York, Lisa showed you that 77% of buildings are responsible, the operation of buildings are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. Nationally, it's about 40%. But people tend to think about how do we solve the greenhouse gas problem. It's through improving the operation of buildings by building new buildings that are green and energy efficient. Another statistic that I thought was interesting, because the Environmental Protection Agency recently released this study that looks at GHGs in a very different way, not just by the sector, industry, transportation, commercial. Instead, it looks at the greenhouse gas emissions associated, it's early, I don't speak that well early in the morning, with the manufacturing of material goods in the United States. And it shows that 42% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the production of things, of stuff that we use and buy. So in this country, what type of goods do we manufacture? This chart shows the top 20 materials, products, and services in the U.S. by the resource use that they consume. And you can see that by far and away, The most resources go to new construction, almost half. And these figures are very consistent with estimates that 30 to 40% of our natural resource extraction every year goes directly to the building industry. So we have a problem here. The other problem we have is this perception that our buildings are disposable. And this is a Brookings study that basically shows that in the next 20 years, if we continue on our current course, that almost 30% of the buildings you see around you today will be gone. And we think this is seriously problematic. Lisa showed you this statistic. I think it's interesting that, you know, the building demolition trends are up. In the last couple of years, they've been down because of the economic recession, but this is going to end at some point in time, and we're going to be right back. So what has the National Trust done about this? Our sustainability program is focused on encouraging these 4 things to happen, and I'm going to give you a little bit about each one of them. First of all, reuse or recycle entire buildings. Deconstruction is great, but we don't think it's part of the solution, but not entirely. And I just gave you the reasons why. It's basically because when you recycle or reuse a building, you avoid the environmental impact of new construction that I just talked about. We encourage reinvestment in older communities. These communities are as sustainable as it gets. They embody all the new smart growth and new urbanist principles. And what we're seeing around the country, this is a community somewhere in either Kentucky or Missouri, I'm not sure which. I did a little road trip about a year ago, and this typifies dozens and dozens of communities that we saw in that part of the world, and there are thousands of them in the United States. All the investment has gone 2 miles down the road to the interstate exchange. It's sucked the life out of this town. This is a Saturday morning, and this town is virtually a ghost town. What do we need to do to bring reinvestment back into these communities? The preservation community is not out ahead of this issue. We have some tools, but I don't think the tools are good enough. Lisa talked about retrofitting green. We know not all old buildings are energy efficient, so we need to improve the efficiency of these buildings. This building, we think, this is the President Lincoln's Cottage Administration building in DC, and we think it combines the best of green building and historic preservation. High tech. This is a very high tech building, but it utilizes the very elements of this building when it was built that was very sensitive to its site. It had these overhangs to shade the upper floors, thick masonry walls. They're also built to last, buildings like this, and they're also, frankly, quite beautiful. And finally, respect historic character and significance. The label fell off this, but this is the Portland Armory in Portland, Oregon. And this is one of the first historic tax credit buildings that also got a LEED certification. It can be done. It's being done more and more every day. So we've had some successes in this in this movement, which I'm going to highlight briefly. At the federal level, we worked really hard to get provisions in the climate change bills and the energy bills in the House and Senate. The climate change bill passed the House, and there is in the retrofit portion of that bill, there's a bump up if you own a National Register building for the rebates you can get through that program. And then these all suddenly morphed into jobs bills, and the House passed a jobs bill with Homestar that Lisa mentioned. And we worked really hard to get into the Homestar bill a provision that they have a list of products that you get rebates on. And we worked hard to get storm windows and storm doors, of all things, in there. Many of the environmental movement, energy efficiency people fought us on this because they said you can't clearly document the exact R value or energy savings you're getting. But we wanted building owners to have a choice. We didn't want them to get completely bamboozled by the new replacement window manufacturing industry that are telling people that this is an easy way to improve the energy and efficiency in your home or your building. Often it is not. So we were able to get those into the Homestar bill, and unfortunately, fortunately it passed the House, but not a lot is happening on it right now. Another area where we've been really successful is the federal historic tax credit that many of you know about. It's been around for 30 years. We didn't. Rutgers recently did a study on the historic tax credit. Over the 30-year period, $16 billion have been invested by the federal government in this credit, and it is a good investment for the federal government. It is directly returned to federal coffers $21 billion, so that's a good return on investment. It's also leveraged about $85 billion in private investment, and it also is a proven job creator. So, another opportunity. I hate to say it, and we shouldn't be overly enthusiastic about the recession we're in. It's extremely serious, even though they don't even call it a recession anymore. But it slowed things down, so hopefully the preservation movement can have an opportunity to think about where we want to get into the dialogue about building reuse. Another opportunity is, this is what everybody's talking about right now, preservation, about sustainable communities, livable sustainable communities. We have long been advocates for this, and this is our issue, and we should be at the table. In the federal government, we're seeing a sea change. Maybe that's not a great use of words here when we're talking about climate change, but there has been a huge change between the last administration and this one in how they talk about the issues of sustainability. HUD, DOT, and EPA have formed this partnership. I mean, this is Ray LaHood, the Secretary of the Department of Transportation. It could be a preservationist speaking. They're talking our language now, which is an incredible opportunity. There's a little bit of a problem with it. These three agencies have been, and many others, including Department of Energy and Rural Development, have been developing programs to get funding out to communities to create more sustainable communities. And the preservation voices in the federal government, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the National Park Service that houses the tax credit program, Secretary of Interior standards, have not been at the table. The preservation voice has been absent. And once again, we find ourselves in the position of suddenly appearing at the 11th hour and saying, uh-oh, there's this thing called Section 106, or there are these local regulations that aren't going to let you do some of these things. Preservation needs to be there early and part of the conversation, because we do have expertise in these agencies, the preservation agencies, on older and historic buildings and reinvesting in communities. And slowly they're beginning to change. The Advisory Council has formed a sustainability task force, and the National Park Service is looking at the Secretary of Interior's guidelines, and I advise all of you who care about this to reach out to the Park Service and see what they're proposing for new sustainability guidelines. In my opinion, and my apologies to anybody from the National Park Service that might be here, it is business as usual. They are not looking at 21st century solutions to these issues and 21st century ways of addressing our own policies and our own guidance. They are still, I believe, working from a 20th century approach. Some of the challenges, climate action plans have sprung up all over the country, or like in Boston, strict regulations about energy performance for your buildings. Once again, preservation voice has not been at the table in these, and Lisa mentioned the opportunity. Many of these are going into the next generation, and it's important for us to be there and be talking about the connection between historic preservation and building reuse and reinvestment in this conversation. Historic preservation is still seen as an obstacle. We are the climate, the preservation police that tell people what they can't do to their home or their building. And what we need to do is change the tone in the conversation and work with people early on to talk about what they can do. Why is this such a big issue? I think we all got a huge wake-up call last February when the Obama administration announced its proposed budget for 2011. And we found that Save America's Treasures and Preserve America had been completely zeroed out of the budget, that $30 million for the 10-year-old Save America's Treasures program, the only bricks and mortar program in the federal government. Heritage areas, I'm sorry about that slide, were cut in half. The Historic Preservation Fund, which funds the preservation work at state and federal level, was cut by a third. So what are our challenges here? I think, as Lisa mentioned, we need to really look at our own policies, take a hard look at them and how they work. Are there some solutions here? For example, is every building a Mount Vernon? Is every historic district like downtown Charleston? There have been suggestions that maybe we look at a tiered approach to the National Register, that we do what they do in Europe, which is classify buildings differently. So it's not a one-size-fits-all the way it is here. Another probably much, much easier approach would be to take a common sense approach to the Secretary of Interior standards or other guidance around historic preservation, and think about the different levels of importance and significance of these buildings, and do you treat them all the same? One of the big challenges we hear about daily is solar panels. What is appropriate and what is not appropriate on historic buildings and historic districts? You're going to hear more about this later from other people. But, you know, how far do we go in regulating something that's reversible? And I know this is extremely controversial, but, and whether you think solar panels make sense or not is another issue. But what are we saying as preservationists, where people basically want to proudly display their badge of environmentalism on their building, and we want them to hide it? The same with green roofs. This is a National Park Service bulletin, and it says, the plantings on these commercial buildings, highly visible above the parapets, are not in keeping with the historic character of the structures. Most people would look at this and say, what's so bad about this? First of all, you don't see it from the streetscape. Is this really terrible? Should we really be forbidding or banning this type of activity? And another challenge that I'm not going to go into is modernism and recent past buildings that were built in an era of cheap energy, and they did not take energy use into consideration. And this is one of the biggest challenges we're facing today. Another huge challenge is Congress. I mean, no matter what happens in the outcome of the elections on November 2nd, we have seen gridlock, and we will continue to see gridlock. When the next Congress starts in January, we have to introduce the bills we've introduced already, like the Homestar has to be reintroduced. The historic tax credit amendments that we've worked so hard on have to be introduced. These amendments have to be reintroduced. These amendments would make the tax credit easier to use. It would make it better for smaller projects around the country, the Main Street or small commercial buildings. And we've worked hard for several years to get these tax credit amendments introduced with bipartisan support in the House and Senate. This year we added an energy efficiency supplement that if you meet a very high performance standard, you could go above the 20% current tax credit to a higher tax credit. So we have to start all over, and based on what we're seeing coming down the road, even in the lame duck, we don't expect to see action on this, and we could see things stymied for many years to come. I'm not going to discuss adaptation. You're going to hear about this from other people today, but even at our own historic sites, and this is the Farnsworth House, not to mention what's going to happen in places like New York City, or last year you heard from Rochelle about London, we are seeing our sites facing the impacts of climate change already. There have been several floods at Farnsworth. This isn't even the worst picture. It's come up a couple feet into the building itself several times in the last few years. Huge challenge to already stressed maintenance budgets, and huge challenge to adapt to what we're going to be seeing as coming down the road, which is why we feel the preservation community needs to engage in mitigating now, at least trying to lessen some of the impacts of what's going to be inevitable, already is happening. I realize I think I listed more challenges here than opportunities, but the really good news here is that the values preservationists have espoused for decades are much more mainstream. The problem is that we aren't really recognized as being part of this conversation, as I mentioned. And those of us who are in the preservation field really need to work hard to look at our own policies and behaviors and demonstrate the connection and the valuable role that preservation can play in the solution to slowing down climate change. Usually when I talk to groups like this, I do what Charles said, which is you need to get engaged. You need to understand what greenhouse gas emissions are. You need to be part of this conversation. We can't sit back and just say, well, you know, that's not going to be good for the historic building, because we have a tremendous amount to offer on this subject. We don't want buildings to be insulated inappropriately or good quality windows to be thrown away for no good reason. So what I love about this group, though, is what MAS is doing. We have 140 statewide local partners around the country, and MAS, and particularly Lisa Kersavage, has really been out in front of this issue and is completely engaged. And I want to thank you, Lisa, and MAS for being such an incredible role model for other organizations. And I hope you spread the word and get everybody doing exactly what you do. Thank you very much. Okay. Anybody have any questions? Anybody think preservation isn't in trouble? Yes.
I go to the National Trust's annual meetings, and in recent years, we all agree all the time. Why are we so ineffective?
It's a really good question. We ask ourselves that every day. And we're doing strategic planning at the National Trust right now. We have a new president, Stephanie Meeks, who used to be at the Nature Conservancy for 18 years, who took over from Richard Moe. Richard Moe was at the Trust for 17 years, and he's the one that really gave us license to get involved in the sustainability issue. And we feel that we're just scratching the surface. The preservation, as you can see by the funding cuts, has really been marginalized. When economic times are tough, it's the first thing that goes. We're seen as kind of the icing on the cake, that we don't bring value to this discussion, and we're those old building people who are a little bit fussy, a little bit elitist. And when we went to speak to the administration, leaders in the administration, right after these funding cuts, some of the messages we got were, well, these programs, the historic preservation programs, are not part of the core mission of the National Park Service. We heard that Save America's Treasures and Preserve America are priorities of the last administration. They did not see the connection between the Obama administration's priorities of more sustainable communities and job creation. I mean, they just, when you start to speak to them about it, though, it's like a light bulb goes off, and they go, aha, perception of preservation, especially at the local level, is that we police people's behavior and that we are not allowing things to happen that should happen. We're struggling with how do we get the message out, and I don't like this word, but educate people or inform people about why it's crazy to keep demolishing buildings when they have generations of useful life left in them. We think it's a communications issue, and we are going to dramatically gear up our ability to communicate about this issue more effectively. Do other people have thoughts or ideas about that? Through the National Trust? No. Through the federal government, yes. The Recovery Act, Department of Energy, EPA have retrofit programs. Many states have retrofit programs. And people are retrofitting buildings. But once again, the message that we bring into that is not there. They're doing it in ways that are basically consuming green products and throwing a lot of stuff away that doesn't need to be thrown away. It's still, as I mentioned earlier, this assumption of consumption. So what we are trying to do is give people choices about how they treat their buildings by getting in there and sort of nitpicking. Some people have said to me, well, it's not really in the preservation historic preservation's mission to be dealing with energy bills and climate change bills, and I think it absolutely is in our mission. If we can make these little tweaks that give people more opportunities to address how they green their buildings in ways that are good for historic preservation, that would be terrific. Are there other things I'm missing, Patrice, about what's out there to help people? One thing we are doing, just so you know, EPA's Energy Star website has no mention of historic buildings and what you do about historic buildings. And we are working with them now on getting a section up on Energy Star about if you have a historic building, here's what you can do that will respect the integrity of your building, keep your property value elevated, because you don't want to destroy it in the process of trying to make it more energy efficient. New. Yes. A lot, for example, and that's a really good point, and we hear that all the time, and the National Trust struggles whether we should try to get into that field or whether we should encourage others to get into that field. The Obama administration is putting a lot of money into community colleges and retrofit programs, and they're doing trainings on retrofits. How do we get preservationists on those part of the curriculum? Right now, it's not happening in any dramatic way. I'm sure there are cases here and there, but it's not something that's even mentioned in these programs that are being developed, and we would like the federal government to recognize the value of that. These are good jobs. They're often high-paying, skilled jobs, and if we can get more people trained in this area. I mean, one thing we hear all the time, too, is I can't repair my windows. There's nobody in my town or community that has the skills to do it, and that's true. It's not very complicated, but contractors would much rather throw out the old window. We didn't get into other issues like affordable housing and lead paint, and there are other issues around windows, so we're not saying you always should keep windows. But on many buildings, they've been there for 150 years, and they will last another 150 years, and nobody's drawing the connection between the fact that if you throw that window away after 150 years, the new one might last you 10 to 20 years, and you start another cycle of consuming and demolition and carting things off to a landfill. So we're not doing a very good job of educating people either that do this work or the environmental community or the green community about why this makes sense environmentally. We are undergoing a study that Patrice or Liz will talk about later on life cycle analysis. This is of materials. So we can really talk about the durability and the longevity of older materials and why it makes sense, if you're looking at the big picture, to save these buildings, save these materials, and reuse them. There was. Well, I didn't talk about LEED today, and the trust made a decision about 4 years ago. A lot of people were saying, why don't you start a historic building certification process like LEED, but only for historic buildings? Or why don't you work with U.S. Green Building Council to start a separate designation for historic buildings? We talked about it a lot and decided not to do that because so many communities were saying you need to comply with LEED and adopting this, that we wanted this value to be sort of impregnated in the LEED process across the board. And that's one thing we've been working on, because LEED, as many of you know, is really about new products and new construction. And we're trying to work with the U.S. Green Building Council, and I have to say the staff has been receptive to this and is aware of this issue, and leadership at the U.S. Green Building Council is as well. It's slow. The changes are incredibly slow. I'm not an expert on LEED. I know they're doing the next iteration of the rating system, and we're hoping, especially with this work we do on life cycle analysis, which they're very excited about, and they've participated in the workshops we've done on sort of designing this life cycle analysis research project. They want to be able to demonstrate scientifically that these materials are durable and that you should reuse more of them and get more points for reusing older buildings. It's a slow process, but I think your comments are right on, and we'd like to see more people. I mean, Patrice is my only full-time person in my office working on sustainability issues, and Liz, for a long time, until like a month ago, was the only full-time person in the Preservation Green Lab doing really cutting-edge, amazing work, working on energy codes, for example, and trying to change the whole mindset, which she'll talk about later. So there's some interesting work going on, but we really want the rest of the preservation community to embrace this. Of course, we want the green building community and the environmental community to embrace this as well, because we think there's a huge connection, direct connection between the built environment and the national environment. But we've kind of been on the sidelines, and it's up to all of us to engage in this. Lisa's giving me the signal, but thank you very much. I'll be around all day.
Thank you, Emily. That was a great call to arms. I'm here to introduce the next panel. I'm very excited about this one. This is Climate Change in New York City. What can we expect, and how can preservationists plan for it? Doug Adamo, yes, come join us, please. So I'm just going to switch out the PowerPoints. Do you want to do that? I just want to say personally, I think the issue of climate change and how it's going to be impacting New York City and how do we adapt is of critical importance. And I'm not sure if we can make the connection to our recent crazy storms in Brooklyn to climate change, but my little 1860s house had a tree thrown like a torpedo through it during the tornado, and then it got a hole in the roof during a hailstorm. So I would say within the crazy storms will definitely be impacting our older buildings. So do you want to go ahead and take a seat? Okay, sorry about that. So I'm very honored today to welcome our two panelists. Bradley Horton is he is Associate Research Scientist at the Center for Climate Systems Research at Columbia University. He conducts regional climate change scenario assessments for stakeholders around the globe based on climate projections and likely impacts of those projections on a variety of systems. You can read his bio in the program, but he's also worked on the science policy team of the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which helped inform Plan YC and their climate change assessment studies. I would just say that Bradley is a very serious scientist, but is able to share this information in a way that's understandable, I think, to non-scientists, which I think is a rare gift. And we also have on the panel Doug Adamo. He's the chief of the National Resource Management Division for the National Park Service at Gateway National Recreation Area since 2003. He worked previously as a forest planner at the U.S. Forest Service, fish and wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a regulatory biologist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and soil scientist for USDA National Resources Conservation Service. He has an AAS in forestry from Paul Smith College, a BS in wildlife resources, and MS in soil science from West Virginia University. And he's going to be sharing some of the modeling that has been done for the National Park Service on the Gateway National Park. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Radley for his presentation.
Thank you, Lisa, for the kind words, and thanks to all of you for the invitation to be here. It's great to be at this event. In the time I have, I'm going to focus my remarks on three of the key climate impacts that may be particularly of relevance from a preservation context for New York City specifically. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the impacts of these changes in climate variables. But of course, you all are the experts on those impacts on these particular sites, be they buildings or natural resource areas or cultural areas or such. But I am going to try to speak a little bit to some of the broader impacts, for example, infrastructure impacts, which are of course directly and indirectly relevant at these more local scales. So I'll talk about some of the work done by the New York City Panel on Climate Change, looking specifically at infrastructure impacts, because I do think that's of relevance. And finally, I really am here to talk about adaptation. I do less work on mitigation, how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and relatively more on steps that can be taken to reduce the hazards, the damage caused by climate changes, and in some cases even to take advantage of opportunities that may present themselves. And while we tend to think of adaptation as being extremely local, mitigation is often thought of as global, given that greenhouse gases tend to stay in the atmosphere for as long as 100 years or more. Changes that we might make locally in our reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, impacts tend to be very global. So there's a tendency to think adaptation, on the other hand, is extremely local. A change you make in a building reduces the vulnerability of that building, for example. While that's true, I'm going to try to make the argument that there are many things that can be done at the city scale, even the national scale, in terms of, for example, increases the amount of porous pavement, getting more green spaces. That's certainly in an interconnected system of networks such as our urban cities. Those city or even larger scale adaptations can be extremely important to reducing vulnerabilities at the building scale as well. So just quickly on the climate hazards before I jump in, really it's fairly simple. I think the three main things to think about certainly are the impacts of these gradual sea level rises that we anticipate on the frequency and intensity of storm surge. These flooding events that happen, whether they're from the nor'easters we often get in the cold seasons, or the much more rare but potentially more severe summer and warm season hurricanes. We don't have that much evidence about how storms themselves are going to change, but we have very strong evidence that average sea levels are going to continue to rise. As they do, it's essentially inevitable that when these storms come, the damage caused by flooding is going to be more severe. So that's in some ways probably issue number one for a place like New York, but we also do need to think about the intense precipitation events that may be associated with more local scale things, whether it's tornadoes coming through, warm season events. I'll talk a little bit about how there's some evidence that those types of brief but very rapid rainfall events that can lead to such huge flooding problems may become more severe in the future, although it's uncertain. And finally, of course, greater frequency and intensity of heat waves as average temperatures go up is also likely to be a huge issue in a variety of ways. Okay, so given that I have limited time, I think I'll jump right into the slides now. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the context for thinking about climate change impacts and adaptation in the New York region. Some of the work that's been going on out of our group at Columbia University Center for Climate Systems Research. I'm going to mostly talk about the New York City Panel on Climate Change. We're also doing an ongoing assessment right now for New York State as a whole, looking at the vulnerabilities to climate change across sectors. and developing adaptation strategies. There's a new project underway also funded by NOAA called the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, which is going to be based out of Columbia, focused very much on the entire urban corridor spanning Philadelphia, New York to Boston, an area, of course, with so many key historic sites of various types. So we're looking to engage with all of you as we develop that project to reduce vulnerabilities to climate change and develop adaptations. So a little bit on the New York City panel on climate change. This really was, I think, one of the leading efforts to date, certainly in the country and globally in a lot of ways, to develop a real framework for thinking about climate change and its impacts. So the New York City panel on climate change is an advisory board that was part of the broader New York City task force looking at adaptation issues. The New York City task force was comprised of 40 different agencies. Private companies in some cases were involved, planning associations that spanned state boundaries. So it really was a comprehensive effort with very high level buy-in, of course, from the mayor, as many of you know, which was critical to its success, obviously. And this panel on climate change wasn't just climate scientists. It included experts on risk management, some of the legal issues that are so key from a preservation perspective, as our insurance issues. So I think that's part of what it made it so effective. And really it was focused on adaptation, and it was focused on infrastructure. So certainly there are a lot of other issues going forward that the city is exploring related to some of the things that you might not think of immediately with infrastructure, but that are so directly relevant to public health, some of the ecosystems and such that need to be part of the discussion as well. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the tie-ins between mitigation and adaptation because they are so interrelated. So the integrative process for the New York City panel on climate change, you had the high-level buy-in at the mayoral level. The Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability was so critical in playing this coordinating role, forging the links with sort of a key decision maker at each of those 40 agencies that I mentioned in the city's task force, which is comprised of transportation, communication, parks, water, and energy groupings. And then you see on the bottom right there, the New York City panel on climate change, which, as I said, not just climate scientists, but legal and insurance experts as well. So as we get into the climate part of the discussion now, I think the starting point before we invoke anything about climate change is just to think about our background, sort of historical vulnerability to climate and weather. That's really the starting point to think about our vulnerability. And most of the key climate changes are probably just going to be in terms of frequency and intensity of some of these threats that we already experience. And certainly there are key vulnerabilities before you even invoke a change in climate. So some of these I mentioned earlier, these mid-latitude winter-type storms that can combine intense precipitation with coastal flooding. That's such a threat to Gateway, for example, and a lot of our key sites as well. Heat waves and flooding, some of the other ones that I mentioned as well. So now when we look at how climate change may impact some of these variables, the starting point and the place where climate models give us the most confident projections is sort of what's going to happen to average conditions. And this plot is, or this chart is just showing some of this very general information. So you see for 4 key variables, really 3 variables, temperature, precipitation, and then 2 different sea level rise projections, a few slices of what you might call the sort of 30-year average conditions. So first, that baseline from 1971 to 2000, New York City's temperature over the last 30 years, or it was 1971 to 2000 on average, the same for precipitation. And then you see for these 3 time slices in the future, the 2020s being sort of like an average temperature for the period 2010 through 2039. We don't have a lot of ability to predict that far in advance. We don't really have any ability to predict what's going to happen in a particular year. We don't know anything about what the year 2018 is going to be like relative to the year 2019. The science isn't there. What we can speak to is how the increase in greenhouse gases over time is going to change the background climate and is going to change some of these vulnerabilities. So the future is uncertain. We can't say exactly how much it's going to warm, but when we look at a range of different climate models, which differ in how sensitive they are to greenhouse gases, some produce more warming for a given amount of increase in greenhouse gas than others. When we also look at a range of what are called emission scenarios, future concentrations of greenhouse gases, which are going to depend on changes in population growth, changes in some of the things we heard about in the last presentation, the extent to which new buildings are built versus retrofits, change in how much new emerging green technologies are shared. These are going to influence the amount of greenhouse gases too. And this type of approach, which combines 16 different climate models with 3 different emission scenarios to give you a range of possible outcomes, suggests that, say, by the 2020s, warming will be on the order of 1.5 to 3 degrees. It's not to say that that's, we can't attach a probability statement to that, but it can be thought of as sort of a most likely change from a planning perspective. And as you see, as you get out to the 2080s or so, the range becomes greater. But really all the climate models as you move out through time suggest that there is going to be this warming. Average precipitation, again, this 30-year average, is fairly uncertain how it's going to change for our region. The models suggest to some extent probably a slight increase in precipitation, but you wouldn't really want to focus on those average changes in the climate. They're just too uncertain. And the year-to-year variability, some of the droughts we've had in the past, not even associated with climate change, like the drought of record in the 1960s, have led to more severe changes in average precipitation than we think climate change itself or changing greenhouse gases are going to bring. But what is very important from a precipitation perspective, not this long-term average, but these brief, intense events, the kind of thing that shut down the subway system on August 8th of 2007. It might be just an hour of extremely intense precipitation. A lot of the climate models, a lot of our understanding of the physics suggests that those types of events are going to become more frequent and more intense. And from a risk management perspective, certainly from a buildings perspective, that's probably issue number 1 in terms of precipitation. Sea level rise is very uncertain. It's basically a given that there is going to continue to be sea level rise in the region. We've had about 1 foot of sea level rise over the past century, due primarily to the ocean height itself increasing as the oceans warm and expand, as ice on land, whether in mountain glaciers or some of the major ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, melt, and that ice makes its way from land to water where it then displaces the water upward. There are also some very local factors associated with land height change that cause New York sea level to go up. So the sort of lower end projection of the type that the IPCC used with their methods back in the 2007 report would suggest that maybe New York would have on the order of, say, up to 2 feet of sea level rise by the 2080s or the end of the century. Recent research, including some of the work that we did for the New York City on panel climate change, suggests that while the exact number is uncertain, there is a possibility really of sea level rise more on the order of, say, 4 feet or so by the end of the century, if not a little more. When we look, I mentioned earlier these extremes, the frequency of the coastal flood events, I'll show you on the next slide, how a seemingly small shift, maybe 2 feet of sea level rise, smaller than the tidal cycle that we currently experience in some places, can nevertheless have an enormous impact on the frequency of, these, say, 1 in 10-year storms, just by virtue of shifting the average heights. So let's turn to that now, and first just to show in a schematic, I hope people can make out the graphic on the top right, showing probability on the y-axis there. And think about it for temperature in this case. So you have temperature on the x-axis, values at the far right, the hot extremes, days over 90 potentially for New York. So what you see first, the first bell curve, if you will, is the one that's shifted somewhat to the left. That could be your current climate. Relatively rare that you have temperatures above that dotted line threshold. Let's pretend that's 90 degrees. Sort of maybe the key take-home message, I think, that resonated the most from a climate perspective with the work we did with New York is that a small shift in the mean, just increasing temperatures a few degrees, profoundly influences the frequency of events at the tail. So you see how often that dotted line event occurs as the bell curve shifts, a relatively small amount. These events that happen relatively rarely in the past become very frequent. Not invoking any change in the distribution. You're not expanding the bell in any way. We don't know if it's going to even become more narrow in some cases. But the shift in the mean produces such a dramatic effect that it's hard to invoke a possible change that wouldn't give you more of these extreme events. What are the numbers when we look at some of the changes in key hazards for New York, days over 90 degrees? You see for the 1970 to 2000 period, a typical year averaged about 14 days over 90. By the time you get to the 2080s, on the order of 3 or 4 times as many days over 90. This means warmer nights, extended heat waves with dramatic impacts. And then that coastal flood event, the level of surge of water that currently occurs once every 10 years, just by virtue of sea level rise being higher with those IPCC scenarios I mentioned, which were just 2 feet or so of sea level rise, not the more extreme scenario. No invoking, not saying storms are going to be stronger or anything like that, just the mean sea level of 2 feet alone gives you that 1 in 10-year coastal flood on the order of 3 times as often. Don't focus on the precise number, whether it's 3 times as often, twice as often. We don't have that level of precision here because the frequency of the storms could change. But just that mean sea level rise alone is going to have a dramatic impact, even though we can't say with precision what the change is going to be. There is going to continue to be natural variability, just as there have been droughts in the past, just as there have been cold years in the past, there'll continue to be. But when we get those hot years, just by virtue of natural variability, a few degrees of extra warming are going to make the impacts far more severe. So I think I've really spoken to most of these conclusions. I'm going to move forward because I know I'm running short on time. There are uncertainties in this science. We do need to continue to go to the next IPCC reports, the latest science. As we develop adaptation strategies, they need to be flexible to these new types of information. So again, I can't speak a lot to the impacts on some of the key assets that we're looking to preserve, but we can speak a little bit about some of the key infrastructure that supports some of those assets. I see Ray in the audience from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, who led this chapter looking at some of the impacts on infrastructure by variable. So from a temperature perspective, certainly key equipment and facilities is going to be damaged more frequently. What happens if the power is going out more often? Certainly that's going to be a key issue for a lot of facilities. And to go into a little more detail about this, just as there are uncertainties in the climate science, there are a lot of uncertainties and a lot of sensitivities when we go to impacts on sectors. So what's shown here is the amount of energy usage in a given day plotted with temperature on the x-axis. This is just 2 particular years for New York. So the key point to emphasize is as you get out that way on the really hot days, 32°C is 90 Fahrenheit, the slope becomes steeper. Having just an extra 1 or 2 degrees has a dramatic impact on the amount of energy that's being used, which is directly linked to the probability of the power going out. Now, the power system is always changing. These risks may reduce potentially or go up with time, but based on these 2 historical years, suggest that a couple more degrees of warming could be associated certainly with more risk of the power going out. Of course, those are precisely the times when, from a public health perspective, when you don't want the power to go out in New York, when it's at its warmest. When air quality already tends to be poor, people are really vulnerable to the stresses if the power is out at those times. So the impacts assessment part is at least as complicated as the climate science, and we need to keep in mind some of those uncertainties as well moving forward. Uncertainties associated with the rate at which air conditioning is going to be taken up throughout New York State, for example. That's been a huge issue in our assessment there. Climate is not your first order uncertainty. If anybody ever tries to tell you, oh, we don't know enough about climate change to try to predict what's going to happen to energy usage. But really, the starting point in many cases, upstate, there's so many areas where people don't have air conditioning today. How might that change in a way that's probably relatively unrelated to climate? It's more socioeconomic factors and other things. That's going to be the key issue influencing any assessments of energy usage in the future. So we shouldn't let climate uncertainties hold us back in some of these types of assessments and adaptation planning. I'm going to move quickly through some of these impacts. When we do think about these more frequent intense precipitation events with higher background temperatures, certainly I would think from a building preservation area, probably a lot of you are thinking about issues related with mold, and which certainly has tie-ins as well as we think about ways to make buildings more efficient. There are probably going to be some new threats in that regard to think about. Sea level rise impacts we've talked about a little bit. Saltwater corrosion may become a bigger issue, for sure. So now turning in the final part to adaptation. I can't speak to a lot of particular building adaptations, but I did want to talk a little bit about the adaptation assessment process that was developed for New York City and some other projects. This may be hard to read, but the basic perspective is to start out with a risk assessment, to link particular climate variables like the types I mentioned to your assets. And then we can think a little about some of the uncertainties associated with the variables, prioritizing of the risk in the assets as well to identify sort of the first key areas to possibly address. Then you brainstorm a full list of possible adaptation strategies. Think about some of the pros and cons associated with the strategies that may have nothing to do with climate per se, Do they provide win-wins with mitigation strategies? Do they provide benefits across all your structures, for example? Those are the kind of things to think about as you prioritize which adaptation strategies may come first. And then the last step in the process, that monitoring and reassessing, because there are uncertainties in the climate science, there are uncertainties, as we said, in how the city's going to change, population distributions, all sorts of key uncertainties in adaptation strategies, things that seem too expensive today may be feasible in the future, and vice versa. We may realize there are some maybe hidden external costs associated with some of these adaptation strategies that seem like a good idea today. So we do need to continually monitor and reassess when we think about adaptations. This discussion of adaptation sounds sort of theoretical, but I want to emphasize that some adaptations are already happening in New York City. Some work we did with DEP, sort of middle of the last decade, led to them identifying particular hazards to their system, both in sort of the upstream reservoirs, water availability side, and the downstream urban flooding and wastewater issues for the city. And they linked particular adaptation strategies to those hazards. In the rainwater drainage side, you can see some of the ideas there, increasing porous pavement and more natural landscapes. And then for the storm surge and wastewater treatment, the first element there, the adaptation to raise elevation of key infrastructure, that's something that's already happening. Wastewater treatment plants throughout the city are all generally located right along the coast in the gravity-fed system. Already out in the Rockaways, efforts are being made to raise some of the elevation of some of the key pumps. That will provide benefits no matter what happens with sea level rise, because they're already vulnerable to some extent to this historical rate of flooding. The 1 in 300-year hurricane could come along any time. You raise the pumps, you have more protection against that type of event. These things are already happening. So summarizing that adaptation assessment process, it is a way to help stakeholders navigate multiple layers of uncertainty. Addressing climate change adaptation as a risk management issue is clear. It's key. There are uncertainties, but in many cases there's plenty of motivation to act because there's already existing vulnerabilities today before you invoke climate change. And this idea of the flexible adaptation pathway is, in some cases, maybe you can pick an adaptation step that will allow you to be flexible in the future. It's not an all or nothing decision today. The metaphor I like to give is, if the adaptation strategy is to build a seawall, maybe, and of course not all adaptations are these sort of hard infrastructure types. They can be policies, they can be more process capacity building types. But if it's a hard infrastructure asset, something like a seawall, the flexible approach would be to start out with a very wide base to that seawall, so that in the future, as new sea level rise information comes in, you'd have flexibility in how high you built that wall. Whereas if you didn't start with a wide base, you'd be sort of locked into whatever decision you made initially about how high the wall would be. And you'd be less able to modify later based on changes in sea level rise projection, based on changes in the value of whatever assets might be behind the seawall, for example. So it's that flexible approach that embraces the uncertainty. I have a few more conclusion slides. How am I doing on time? Okay. So some of the key findings here, really speaking about the New York City panel on climate change specifically. These are some of the findings of the panel. It is time to begin to adapt to climate change already today. There are a number of vulnerabilities that already exist. There are potential tipping points in the system. It's not all just going to be gradual changes necessarily moving forward. If we see a dramatic change in sea ice extent, for example, over time that could lead to fairly dramatic changes in the circulation, the atmosphere, the paths that rainstorms take in moving across the country. There are the potential for surprises there. So from a more impacts perspective, many of the tools already are in place to facilitate adaptation. There are robust approaches being used on the government side and the insurance side and other places to think about managing these hazards and risks. We should, when we think about adaptation, think about design standards, certainly, something that came up earlier. A legal framework is key in this endeavor, and we're going to have to work with the insurance industry, certainly. It doesn't all have to be these sort of major investments in seawalls, like I mentioned. Some of you know there's been discussion of storm surge barriers as a possibility, but sometimes it can be something as simple as operations, changing how often just making sure that storm drains are being kept clean, integrating your weather forecasting at short time scales with making sure somebody's out there just sweeping the drains at times of year like now when flooding can be such a major problem with all the leaves and such. Inexpensive things that make sense to do today that can have a major impact on reducing reducing risk without huge investment. And certainly policies need to be considered as well. So, okay, that's all I had. Thank you. Let me just say just a couple other things that really resonated in the earlier presentation. Thinking about livability, just increasing the livability of the city and taking this sort of integrated perspective where we're not just focusing on adaptations for a particular spot, but building a more resilient city generally, where we're not just reducing climate hazards, we're reducing overall vulnerability, making the city more livable and more resilient. And of course, one of the ways to do that, to take that integrated approach, is to not pigeonhole adaptation and mitigation, but to include them together, whether through increased energy efficiency, reduced energy usage, which reduces the risk of power failures, while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, while improving air quality. We saw a green roof slide as well as a way to reduce the amount of flooding that's happening in the city, maybe reduce the amount of energy that needs to be used as well. So there are potential for mitigation and adaptation to be win-wins. They also can work in conflict, so it's important to integrate in a way to make sure that they support each other rather than working against each other. So the passive survivability idea, for example. Okay, thanks. Do you want to take questions now, or are we going to? Okay, good.
So just while we switch PowerPoints, next let me welcome Doug Adama from the National Park Service.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? I think this, is this on? It's not on. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you're sort of, you're double mic'd.
Oh, okay. That's good, because I have kind of a soft voice, so double mic is good. Thanks for inviting me here. It looks like I'm not the lone natural resource guy. Anybody else out there that might be in the natural resource field that's attending? Oh, maybe I am then. Oh, you, okay. But listening to Emily remarks about the Park Service, that we definitely should be paying more attention to the sustainability guidelines. I'm down at the park level, but I certainly can try to voice that to our new superintendent who's acting right now, but she has her background is in historic preservation, so that's good news for you all. The title here is a little bit deceiving. I'm going to talk a little bit about the general management plan for Gateway National Recreation Area in terms of incorporating climate change into the management plan. The management plans for the Park Services, all parks in the system, are meant to guide the park for 20 to 25 years, and our current one has been since the inception of the park in 1972, when President Nixon signed the legislation. He wasn't all bad, to create Gateway National Recreation Area. The park is 26,000 acres in size. A lot of that is water. Roughly about 10,000 of it is water. But we have a great assembly of cultural and natural resources in the park that, have been and will be affected by climate change, sea level rise. Shortly after Gateway was created, Golden Gate, our sister park on the other side of the country in San Francisco, was created a few months later. So we go down in history as the first real urban park. And here's an example of a couple on the left, Battery Weed, which I won't even attempt on the year that was built. I think it was around the time of the Civil War, maybe a little bit after that. And then the oldest working lighthouse in the country at Sandy Hook. And then, of course, on the other side, that's my bag, the natural resource, which provide visitors enjoyment for birding, etc. And the green on the map is the extent of Gateway. So you can see we're kind of spread out all over the place. Sandy Hook in New Jersey, and then Jamaica Bay over in Brooklyn and Queens. And then Staten Island, we have 3 sites, Fort Wadsworth, Millerfield, and Great Kills. I'm drawing a lot, this presentation draws a lot from the IPCC information, the 2007 information in which some of the best scientists in the world, I think Dr. Horton also alluded to this, the data that came out of this, that they're trying to answer those 4 questions on the right. And so we drew some of the data, but also some of the modeling comes from our partnership with right here at Columbia University. So as far as the physical system is concerned, and I don't know how this jives with, it seems to jive with Dr. Horton's presentation, that about 0.4 degrees centigrade expected increase within the next 20 years, which I think that's about 0.75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, doesn't sound like much, but when you talk about the ice melting, ice caps and the glaciers, we have Glacier National Park also out in Montana, and I've seen some, I don't have it in this presentation, but some dramatic pictures of what the glaciers look like back in the 1920s versus what they look like today. There's considerable ice melt even on those. So what will we call that park, after the glaciers are all gone? Used to be Glacier National Park. So greenhouse gas emissions at the current rate would cause, further warming, induce the changes in climate during the 21st century. And this is very likely based on the IPC data. And of course, the warming is projected to be greatest over land at the higher latitudes where we are and higher on up into Canada. And we've all heard about the precipitation changes in storms and hurricanes are predicted as likely. So there's not, again, as Dr. Horton alluded to, the weather data is not as predictable. Here's something we threw in on just to show the difference between the 1979 polar ice cap and the 2005. I wish I had a 2010 summer minima, but that's a pretty dramatic decline in the ice cap. And that's just the North Pole. I didn't have any data on the South Pole. This is pretty dramatic for our area. You could see pretty clearly that this is in millimeters per year increase. 1950 to 2000, the red being the highest, between 1.2 orange to red to 2. And you can see along our east coast and in the Gulf, southern tip of Africa, Australia, those are some of the hot spots. So, of course, we're very concerned. And then the coastal parks, not just the national parks, but, since I'm working for the Park Service, I have to be concerned with the coastline of Gateway National Recreation Area and the cultural and natural resources. Even though I'm the natural resource guy for the park, I work very closely with our cultural resource staff in trying to develop ways to adapt. And of course, we're already experiencing some of these hazards when the storms, the nor'easters come up. They seem to be, getting higher and higher up above mean sea level. And the coast, the exposure to the risks are becoming compounded by, other climate change factors, like displacement in terms of what I do, displacement of habitat, increase invasive species that used to be below a certain latitude, restricted to the southern states. Now we're finding them up here in New York City. And then, of course, we're very concerned about our lowest lying areas, especially the salt marshes and the other coastal wetland ecosystems, and especially in Jamaica Bay, where, and here's a map of your salt marshes in Jamaica Bay. It's not a good one to see the infrastructure around it, but you can imagine Brooklyn and Queens surrounding on the top there to the north. There's no natural buffer system for these coastal areas to expand within the estuary. So the red and the green together represent the 1951 salt marshes, and then the green is what is currently left today. Actually, a little bit less because that's 2003. The rate that New York State DEC and the National Park Service have come up with is roughly about 30 to 35 acres wetland loss per year, which is pretty dramatic. And we have restored that uppermost marsh there where there's just thin green areas. Those are now pretty much filled back out again to almost their original extent, or their extent back to 1951, because of Corps of Engineers' beneficial use of dredge material projects. They partner with us, and we did get, we're close to 100 acres restored salt marshes now. But that's not really keeping pace with the loss. These are just some things that I'm sure you've all heard of, as indicators of climate change in the Northeast. And not just lilacs blooming area, but but there are other plant species that I can't name them all off the top of my head, but there's quite a few more than just the lilacs. And also losing our Adirondack spruce fir forest up north. And they predict that when I went to the state wildlife climate change meeting in Albany, the prediction was by 2025, which was not far away, all the spruce fir in the Adirondacks would be shifted up into Canada, with none left in the Adirondacks, and that would pretty much take the spruce warbler out of the United States. And that's just one species. This, apologize for repeating some of Dr. Horton's information, just presented in a different way. The days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts. It's pretty dramatic from, 1 up until 1990 to up to 24, somewhere within that range of 2070 to 2099, and then kind of illustrate it with the state of Massachusetts. What it would feel like would be as if the state was in South Carolina. And I'm sure you might have seen there's one for New York State that places New York just a little bit north of South Carolina and southern North Carolina. And this is just another graphic illustration of sea level rise from several models showing, if you look at starting at 2010, the most conservative models about a little less than 15 centimeters above sea level, and that ranges all the way up to 155 toward the end of this century, and that's like a 150 centimeter difference, and from the conservative one about 25 centimeters to 155 centimeters, both of course significant, even the conservative model. And I'm sorry to throw numbers up here. I don't like number slides very much, but this basically just shows elevation. The current elevation above mean sea level is on the left, and these are 3 units and some of the historic buildings and other sites located within those sites. and where they would be in relation to mean sea level in the scenario of conservative estimates and the effect of rapid ice melt from 2020 to 2080. So you can see, at least with the on this one, we have at least one building, the Reese Bathhouse, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a historic building that we did rehab that one. Would be close to being underwater, or at least water lapping up against the building in 2080. And then this is adding in data from the nor'easter in '92, which was a 7.7-foot surge. You see a lot more negative numbers up there, meaning that more buildings and other structures would be impacted by that. I know it's kind of a gloom and doom scenario, but this is what the models are supposed to be pretty good ones. They were developed partly here in Columbia. This is with respect to the 1960 Hurricane Donna, which was even higher of a surge, 8.4 feet, and now you see a lot more negative numbers. So it's pretty dramatic. And you can see how many, these are just a fraction. We have, I think it's over 200 historic buildings within the park. A lot of it military, defense, all the way to the Cold War, Nike missile sites in Sandy Hook, even some Revolutionary War, at least sites, archaeological sites. They may not be structures, but it does go back that far. And here is Fort Hancock historic landscape in Sandy Hook, northern part of Sandy Hook. Under current conditions, these buildings are, again, I'm the natural resource guy, so the dates might be off, but I'm thinking it's 1874 through World War II, mostly between World War I and World War II. These are the officers' row, the straight line of houses that you see along the shoreline of Sandy Hook Bay. There's quite a few. I think there's about 61 structures in this area. The same area with the 2020 rapid ice melt model that Dr. O'Horton also showed the data for. The blue would be the water. And then the 2050 rapid ice melt model due to nor'easter. So even more coverage, more doom and gloom for Sandy Hook. And then proceeding with the 2080 data, you only have about 5 or 6 buildings there that are not at least flooded with about one foot of water. And then this is with the hurricane data. The red would be, it's coming in, encroaching even further. And then this would be the 2080 plus the nor'easter 2020 model with the rapid ice melt. And the red being the deepest water. I think we had the wrong. I just wanted to show we did have another slide in between there. I guess it didn't get in there, but it showed the Sandy Hook site, the historic site there, with variable water depths, and we added that slide because it's not as bad as this looks when you break it down into different water depths. So we had, like less than 1 foot, 1 foot to 2 foot, 2 to 3 feet, and there's a whole lot less of encroachment on buildings with that slide, and more inundation of some of the lower natural areas and wetlands, which actually would enhance some of those wetlands, which would be a good thing for us. This is the Reese Beach bathhouse in the background there, and you can see we're the third most visited park in the park system behind Great Smokies and Grand Canyon. Next comes Gateway because of the beaches, really. And so we're very concerned that, we've had storms that come right up where the ocean surges have come right up to the bathhouse. And there's an example of, our maintenance facility people were removing the sand that came up right up to the historic bathhouse. One of the adaptations we were thinking of was we have some areas where passive recreation occurs and there are no real structures, historic structures. These are some of the areas we can, pretty much don't have to do a whole lot as far as, adapting to storm surges because the structures are not affected. And so, picnic areas, you can still picnic there after the storms subside. The problem is, how far, are they gonna go before the greenhouse gas problem is abated? And then in the workshops that I've attended in New Jersey and New York, even if we stopped all greenhouse gases today, they're saying that there's a lag time of about 30 to 40 years before, we really see any, ice buildup. In other words, reversing the ice melt situation. How are we doing? Okay. Coastal impacts, I'll go through these real quick. Protecting and restoring the coastal ecosystems, which we are doing, but this is going to be more of a challenge every decade. And then, of course, we want to share the information with other agencies. We are doing that, and other organizations to gain some insight on how we can be flexible and adapt, and still provide visitors with the National Park Service experience. And one of our mission, Park Service mission, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, is to preserve unimpaired the cultural and natural resources of our park system for future generations, for this and future generations. And so how do we do that? We have to answer a lot of questions about, in our plan, about the effects of climate change and that's why we're doing these predictions and why we're continually gaining data. Although I personally think it needs to be strengthened, just like the sustainability guidelines for preservation need to be strengthened. And just some ideas about how to adapt would be to identify areas where we can have an influence and partner more broadly, like I just said, and use this issue as an opportunity to educate people about natural ecosystems, and I should add about the historic features of the park, and of course be a lead agency and set an example for taking action. And this is kind of a redundant slide because I just mentioned the mission, so we'll skip that. And thank you.
So we're running a little bit behind, but I want to give all of you an opportunity to ask some questions, maybe just for 5 minutes, and then we'll go to our coffee break. So logistically, I guess maybe if you guys want to stand up here, we can start to take some questions, or sit here. Just talk closely into the microphone.
Don't want to get us. Yes.
So, anybody have any questions?
Should I take that? Yeah. So I didn't hear the details of what you were talking about specifically. Is it a general question about storm surge barriers, or? Oh, the Venice. I got you. Yeah, I don't know that much about the Venice barrier. If I'm not mistaken, the cost was something in the order of $6 billion or so. Of course, some of the issues are very different here than the issues faced in Venice. There's a much bigger threat of storm surge. For example, we have this hurricane risk in the background, which, even before you think about sea level rise, it's harder to plan for that. The 1 in 100, 1 in a 200 year surge is a bigger one than it is there. Venice is also subsiding, I believe, at a much faster rate than here. But so I don't, basically the short answer is I don't know the specifics of what's the same and what's different. But I will just say in general with storm surge type barriers, there are many considerations to keep in mind. There are certainly a lot of cons that can go. One of the prime ones being the risk of a false sense of security, potentially. Hurricane risks aren't just associated with surge. We have to think about things like the wind damage. Have to think about what happens if the barrier fails. Have to think about what happens to the areas just outside of the barrier. In many cases, you're probably going to have an elevated flood risk just outside the protection area. There are also many potential pros, sediment transport issues too. So, certain that from my perspective, and I think many people's perspective now, that's an area that's certainly worthy of more research. We shouldn't be writing it off as a possibility, but maybe we're not there yet in terms of making any decision, given the potential for major cons in addition to the obvious pros.
Steve?
Most people in the room are probably way ahead of any of my thinking on that. When I mentioned passive survivability, sort of the extent of my knowledge was just hearing the example sometimes that cases where you have, for example, buildings where the windows might not open as as a way to be very energy efficient, but what happens in the event of some type of disaster? How do we design in ways where you don't have those two things potentially in conflict? But I'd be interested in hearing others' thoughts. I think, that's not something I know a ton about. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you're more of an expert than I am on that.
Yes, in the back?
Was that directed to me? Oh. Yeah. I think that's an really important point, and I know we do work with the city, federal government and city government and the state government together in developing plans like the Jamaica Bay Watershed Protection Plan, which does have green infrastructure pilot projects built into it. And then another part of that same plan does get to that point about not building in areas that are high risk. And we do have maps, there are maps available that show the high risk areas under different scenarios, a conservative on up to the, worst case scenario. So, that's one I know within the Park Service, we don't want to build any new structures, period. And then if we ever did need to, it would definitely not be in the high risk areas. But the problem is we don't, even for shoreline protection structures, which we don't like to use either, but sometimes we have to, like in the case of Plum Beach, along the Belt Parkway, we might have to, actually put in a structural wall instead of trying to create a natural, coastal dune system there, because it won't be sustainable. So that is an excellent point, yeah.
Yeah, just maybe to quickly add, if you are going to build, are there ways you can, have the first floor be floodable? are there ways to make sure you're thinking about, you know, what types of nasty materials could potentially get out if the building were flooded? Those are all things that, you know, need to, if they aren't already, maybe they already are, but if not, they need to be sort of fundamental in all the decision making. And just, oh,
okay.
go ahead. No, it's good.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think we have time for just one more question. So you had your hand raised.
I think the two that probably jump out the most are anything to increase energy efficiency as a key one, and then all the advancements we're seeing on the sort of porous pavement, more green surfaces side of things jump out the most. Probably in the longer term horizon, there are more sort of sea change types of things in terms of smart grid technologies, for example, larger step changes. But I think energy and stormwater are two things people are talking about a lot today, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much. That was really extremely informative. We're going to break now for a quick coffee break. We're a little bit behind schedule, so let's keep it to 10 minutes. You're welcome to bring back coffee and food into the auditorium. Thanks. Thank you. That was so great. I know it was great to see you. I know it's I think it's freezing in here.
Okay, I'll have to make it warmer.
Okay.
The rest of our panelists are all very anxious to make sure that like their stuff is set up. So I'm gonna kind of tell them that they
Tell them
already know
come to see me because it is set up actually.
So then what I'm gonna have them do is everyone. I think everyone should sit here, do their presentation one at a time. We'll set up their name cards so they know where to sit. Do you care what order they're sitting in?
Over there, no.
Okay.
They know their order of presentation here.
Okay.
Because I realized that was awkward. I hadn't thought through what we were doing with that
It's
one.
working now.
Twice. Yes. Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, hi, Nathan. How are you? Yeah, you too. Yay. Okay. Okay. So.
Just words that put it on together on a lame PC that the formatting might get screwed up, but we'll see.
Oh, okay.
Hopefully
We've
not.
got it. We're supposed to use our PC, but usually the Mac will.
Okay, great. I have my PC with me too, so.
We can. Oh, hi. David called me yesterday.
My little keys.
Oh, this shouldn't work. Let's see. Yeah, that's it.
You sort by date, it's just the most recent MAS.
Two options. One is that this is the remote. This goes forward, backward, and that's the laser from the camera. The other option is to use an arrow key.
We were making it work.
Oh yeah, you have yours on your
I have
question,
mine.
right?
He's just trying to check.
High performance. Oh, performance, but whatever. It's at midnight. I'm spelling things like that.
No, it's an MAS one. Is there any way just to view or look at it?
mic is super low, so you might need to lean in a little bit to it. Oh, okay. Or project. And we have your PowerPoint up. Juan Camilo is going to help switch them out. After you speak, you can sit back down, and then when we have the discussion, everybody's going to sit here at the table. Okay. And those mics are also very low, so you need to speak like right into it and loudly.
Whose presentation is this?
Okay, so that's Jeremy. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Yes, you are mic'd first. Although if it's
Well, then why don't you just use this, but just make sure you speak into it well. You're the first actual presentation.
you do have to. It's a little odd. You have to. If you put your hands on here, it'll force you to. That's what I started to do.
So the order is first Jean,
Jean,
and then this one.
and then no, SM is last actually.
Oh.
It's Jean, and then Nathan,
Okay.
and then Jeremy.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
I will come switch this off.
You'll have to be mic'd. Hi, nice to meet you. Yeah, good to see you. There's some mic issues, so you're going to have to be double mic'd. I'm just going to lean in because I'm just introducing everyone. Try to. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Judith. After I did have identified them as I left the room. Oh, I have. Oh, you do? Oh, I would love a copy of it. Emily was making some. Oh, yeah. And actually, I'm going to need to get back here. So yes, what I will do is I have a stopwatch. So I will, oh, thank you. I will run the stopwatch when I get to 10. Usually even when I sit up, but I might just like do that. And I'll do that for each person. And then I think that I might be, for the questions, I might stand up here just because I can see people and I can control, and I'll actually choose people. And it's going to start with you. Oh, actually, you can do one. Yeah, well, this is great time. What's in within questions, right? So I don't know where the, anything questions, is it yes? Oh, yes, no, you should do that. Just don't. That should be at the very end. Yes. And then we may do a little bit if people run long, or we do more. I know people have a lot of questions. I think for this one, you have a minute buffer for lunch, but okay. And that will be also my name. Okay, that will be my job. And you're okay. Hi, everyone. Could you please take your seat? We're going to get started. Hi, if everyone could take their seat, please. We need to stay on schedule. I wanted to let you know that we recognize that it's very cold in here, and we're trying to do something about it. So hopefully it'll warm up pretty soon. Yeah, come on up. No, we're ready. So with that, we're going to kick off the next session, and Judah Saltzman.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for organizing this great series of... I was thanking Lisa and thanking her for organizing this. I'm Judith Saltzman. I'm the co-chair of the Preservation Committee of the Municipal Art Society, along with Charles Platt, and the principal of Lee Saltzman Architects. And I am here to be the moderator for the Making It Work case studies in high-performance preservation retrofits. This is a chance where we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of specific projects. And while preservation and sustainability share many of the same philosophical underpinnings, when it comes to sharing the same building, there are potential conflicts. I'm delighted to introduce 4 speakers who have made it work, ensuring that historic buildings contribute to a sustainable future. The first speaker will be Jean Caroon, and I'm going to introduce everyone, and then they'll speak sequentially to save time. Jean Caroon of Goody Clancy. She'll be presenting the John McCormick Post Office and Courthouse, a 700,000 square foot 1930s landmark building in Boston, where they preserved the courthouse and adaptively used the post office section as a Class A office building. This was done with the federal government as the client and the Environmental Protection Agency as the primary tenant, and it's a certified LEED Gold project. The second speaker will be Nathan Taft of Jonathan Rose Companies. He will speak on 2 projects. One will focus on preserving and greening existing affordable housing in New York City, a specific challenge. They've dealt with a project on 135th Street where they have 198 units that comprised originally of 10 6-story buildings, originally built in 1905, and this is 100% low-income housing using stimulus funds. And he'll also present the greening of a 14-story 1920s historic retail and Class B office building in Seattle, also certified LEED for existing buildings, LEED Gold. Our third presenter will deal with a project at a smaller scale, Jeremy Shannon of Prospect Architecture. He has created a passive house, a highly efficient construction, virtually airtight, a form of sustainable design that we see more commonly in Europe, particularly in Germany, than we do in the US. And he did so within a 120-year-old row house in the Park Slope Historic District in Brooklyn. And our fourth speaker will be Stephen Apking of SOM, who has created a master plan for the Inland Steel Landmark building in Chicago, originally designed by SOM mid-century of the 20th century. And this project deals with the issues of reconciling the preservation of mid-century modern materials and aesthetics with sustainability. And it also explores the use of integrated systems and modular design to sustainably accommodate change. And we have heard a lot earlier today about demolition and the constant waste source from the ongoing renovations. And this is a project that addresses that. So as you can see, there's a substantial variety in the building types and the ages of the buildings, the style, the size, yet all of them represent solutions, innovative solutions to retrofitting historic buildings. So please welcome our 4 speakers, and Jean, please. Thank you.
Well, it's a great privilege to be here. It's always very heartening to me to see what the MAS is doing, and always makes me feel that I should be more active in trying to make the same kind of thing happen in Boston and elsewhere. I had pledged to myself, since Lisa's very strict about time, that I would not editorialize. But how can I not editorialize after listening to such great speakers this morning? you are going to see that we can absolutely make individual buildings greener. We can absolutely reduce their environmental impact. But I would say that in these case study presentations, the very fact that we are focusing on individual buildings points out how far we have to go in thinking about a sustainable world. And you'll hear that this afternoon when we talk about eco-districts, when we talk about larger plans for larger communities. We should not be thinking about individual buildings as energy sources and energy users. We really need to be looking at block-wide eco-districts, neighborhoods. As long as we are only looking at energy use intensity on a building-by-building basis, it will not serve historic buildings well. And that is something we should talk about. Oh, isn't that nice, my first comments. Okay, so I've used up 2 minutes. Okay, let me go into the case study and show you how we can make individual buildings more sustainable, and we certainly can meet the LEED standards. That is not an issue. That is a complete red herring. We can make historic buildings meet LEED guidelines, and we can get certification. So I would point out that there is a lead time always. That's the LEAD kind. We interviewed for this building in this project in February of 2002. We began work on it that year. It went into construction after some delays because of the economy. They moved into it in 2009. A lot happened between 2002 and 2009 in both U.S. Green Building Council, in the awareness about sustainability, and in technologies. We did not capture all of those, but we did have a fabulous team, and we do, I think, have a fabulous project. So there's a building that is right in the heart of Boston. Zoning actually had to be changed when this building was built in the 1930s to allow the radical Art Moderne construction of it. It was an example of a resurgence and funding at that time that was about the economy. It could say that again now. It is very much a building of its time, and it continues to be a building of its time. The U.S. General Services Administration was our client. They are a fabulous client. They own a great deal of building stock. I have long believed that their early support of the U.S. Green Building Council is the reason we all know what LEED is, and continues to be a reason that LEED is a major player and the U.S. Green Building Council is a major player. Our goals were very simple. It was to make a world-class sustainable preservation project, to utilize this building and make it a case study. At that time, the GSA had no LEED accredited or LEED certified buildings. And I would have to admit that the interview was in February of 2002. And so in February of 2002, I took the LEED exam to become a LEED accredited professional when I went into the interview, which I never told the GSA, but I actually passed it the night before the interview. It still counted, you know. So it was unusual at that moment. There weren't a lot of LEED accredited professionals, and since then I was happy to refine my certification sheet because USGBC had lost all record that I was LEED accredited. So not their fault, a lot of bureaucracy. So this is what we did. They actually required LEED or mentioned it in the RFP, and then in the design process they asked that we meet the LEED Silver certification. At that time, it was actually under the 2.0 system. The final certification was 2.2. This is just looking at what the LEED certification charts are. Many of you are familiar. This is now all online. It isn't as easy to print these out. But it is a certified building. We did achieve 43 points. We have looked at that and used it as a case study for why we don't consider LEED to be any kind of barrier in working in historic buildings. It was a very integrated team and a very integrated process. We had fabulous consultants, Cosentini Associates, Viridian Energy Environment, which was a spin-off from Stephen Winter Associates. We also had the EPA as a tenant and the GSA, all very knowledgeable people, and they all came to the table, and we started the conversations very, very early on about what sustainability meant. And there were essentially two conversations, which we'll talk about a little later this afternoon, but there were conversations about how to achieve LEED and conversations about how to be sustainable. And there was an interesting dialogue back and forth in all of those. There were also conversations about what their mandates were. For instance, the EPA has a very strong mandate to reduce the energy use intensity in their leased spaces, and that drove some of the decisions that we made in the building, which might not have been as sustainable but met their directives. So under sustainable sites, you realize, and I would just say that the other thing that I do think that LEED indicates, and talking about individual buildings indicates, is it still refuses to acknowledge, or perhaps none of us can acknowledge because it's so complicated, how interwoven every single piece of this is. There are not 5 separate sections that you can check boxes on. Everything feeds to everything else. And if you know if you have any kind of awareness of the environment, you know that that's true. You cannot do something in this part of the world and not have it affect another part of the world. You cannot work in sustainable sites and not have it affect something else. Everything is interwoven, and always when we're making decisions about trying to improve our environmental or reduce our environmental degradation, we are constantly balancing what are the issues of the moment. At the issues of the moment, greenhouse gases actually override many of the other things. I'm not sure they should, but I'm not the climate scientist, and I'm certainly not the policy person. I'm just pointing out that it all ties together. So for sustainable sites, historic buildings often do quite well because they're often located in very dense transit-oriented areas. So we did get 11 out of the 14 points. Some of these are what you might call purchase points. There's a plug-in site for the in the lower part of the building in order for electric car. I think that's probably a little bit of a joke, but it did get us a point. So no offense to the GSA. You know, on other projects, we've actually, the USGBC early on was very open to us switching out some of that. You used to get a point for plugging a car in, but early on we started appealing for getting a point for having a zip car parking place instead. And so they started, the part of what feeds the USGBC and the LEED system is being challenged on these things and what happens. Now, sustainable sites, this is right in the heart of Boston. You're looking across a park that used to be a parking garage that is now below grade. So it's a very successful pocket park area in Boston, a very busy area, a lot of traffic, a lot of transit places around it. Now, water efficiency is a very, very, very sore point for me because water is hands down a completely underestimated, urgent issue everywhere. It doesn't matter how much rain you get. It doesn't matter what part of the world you're in. Water is a very key issue, and we are not taking it seriously enough. Now, water ties very directly to energy use. We actually use about 40% of the fresh water in this country to cool our energy plants. And nuclear plants actually use more water than coal-fired plants. So there are trade-offs back and forth. But when we think about water in buildings, we often just think about the amount that we use to wash our hands or for toilets. But actually, a very substantial part of water in buildings often goes to cooling towers. And they have traditionally always used potable water. That's an important issue. Another 10% of water usage in this country for fresh water is attributed to leaks in our infrastructure. 10 to 20 is what you sometimes read. Sometimes Australia says it's as high as 25 in their system. But the infrastructure for water is one of the largest investments in this country. I believe it's approximately $82 billion. And so New York has been at the forefront of looking upstream in their water supply and thinking in a watershed management way. So when you only get 5 points in a system where water is going to be the next international issue, I do take exception to that and do think that we really have to rethink what we're talking about. Now, we did get water efficiency. We did actually put a green roof into the building in this area that is a current light well. It is a great amenity. It is hands down our most visible and celebrated green feature in this building. Trade-off, all of those cooling, all of that mechanical equipment went up to the 16th, 18th, and 20th floors. That means you have to pump things farther. That means our electrical loads went up because you had to pump those, everything that goes up and down that building has to go farther in its track. So we do have this wonderful amenity. It does help a heat island effect. It does capture stormwater. It does have a cistern. And it is much loved by all the tenants. But there are always trade-offs. Now, one of the things about green roofs that we're all learning, of course, is they also help natural habitat. And I have actually gotten emails from people I know that have buildings across the way who have told us how much they love the green roof. They've also mentioned the people that sunbathe on the roof, but I will not comment on that. So, energy and atmosphere, of course, this is the issue that is so key, but this is also, I believe, a red herring. Energy use intensity is a very false metric. We all know that building size is growing. The studies that have come out of England show that the courts of the present that have been made in the last 5 years have the lowest energy use intensity, but they're 40% larger than the historic courts, have the same level of functionality, but they're bigger. Energy use intensity is a very, very false metric for whether we're making smart decisions when we use more materials to do what we need to do. We do believe that you can reduce energy use in a building by just being smart and by capturing maintenance and operations opportunities. That's key. You don't just green a building and walk away. Maintenance and operations is hands down as important, if not more important, than what we do when we design around buildings. Materials and resources, you know, another little bit of a sore point as far as are we being realistic in what we're trying to do to green the world. I think I'm not an expert in either LEED or Green Globes or BREEAM, but I have been told that BREEAM which is the British system, does a better job of capturing the point that every time you use a material, every material has an extraordinary upstream, downstream impact of waste behind it and toxicity. So the more we can reduce the use of materials, the better that is. That's not a very popular thing to say. I think the last time I spoke about something I call nega building, which is the idea that we use the resources we have, was at the AIA conference. Oddly enough, that didn't go over really well. So anyway, we can reuse the buildings. It is important to reuse them. There are studies coming out that are also important that show that when people are in spaces that they love, historic spaces in particular that are richer in detail, that they're more willing to accept variances in personal comfort. And so that gives us more leeway in whether a building is considered to be comfortable and whether the mechanical system has a little bit more flux. These kinds of things, perceptual comfort, is something we're not very good at thinking about, but it is an important part about sustainability that we don't capture necessarily. Indoor environmental quality, of course, once again, this ties to toxicity. But this is an area also where we could have captured more points and where I do applaud the LEED system had we had better documentation, had we been able to capture and engage more of the subcontractors, we would have achieved more points here. So this is an area where LEED really does make a difference in your construction team. We did capture, of course, views, daylighting and views, but this isn't something that we'll talk about later, that we'll hear in one of the other case stories. There's a big question about whether it really makes sense to sort of gut all our buildings. Do we really want to rip everything out of the insides of our buildings in the name of flexibility? And if that's the case, do we then want to leave things more exposed so it's much easier? If the building has a multi-hundred-year life cycle, shouldn't we leave the systems more exposed so they can be switched out in the 20, 30-year cycles? This is something Stuart Brand brought up in How Buildings Work. Innovation and design, we got these points, you know, you can plan ahead. What we didn't get points for was something that I loved about the project, that the GSA really encouraged us to go for research money, and indeed we rewrote the grant applications and they went after them. We got grant money to look at some off-the-wall things, to study things like fuel cells, which are no longer quite as off-the-wall, and steam back pressure turbines. And some of the studies showed that things we had thought we could do as a team really didn't make sense at that moment in time. But one of the things that I was most intrigued by is in the brainstorming, we discussed the idea that titanium dioxide, which is most often used on the outside of buildings to clean because it absorbs the pollutants and turns into water and runs off, we hypothesized that you could put that on the inside of glass and it would actually interact with the fluorescent lights and create a better indoor air quality, which turned out to be true, but the life cycle analysis on the titanium dioxide and how it is mined made it a non-starter. And that was an interesting study for me, always looking at the scientific evidence of what we're trying to do, whether it was the right thing to do or not. You know, this audience knows I just don't get why the rest of the world doesn't see it. Preservation is obviously the very first thing we should be doing in thinking about sustainability. It makes sense on every front. And so I don't quite get why we're having such a hard time getting that story out. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Taft. I'm from Jonathan Rose Companies, and it's a pleasure to be here. I specifically asked Jean not to be very good, and she just was terrific. As she said, she took all the great comments, so I'll try to bat clean up. And boy, you guys, I don't know what you're going to... I'm going to talk to you today about actually preservation and greening within the context of working with private clients. When you have the GSA as a client, often you've seen like the GSA and universities like Columbia and others leading the way on green building and innovating far faster than the private market. But so today the case studies I'll talk to you about is a vehicle, or basically we're supported by a vehicle we created to bring private equity to bear on the greening of existing buildings. Just briefly, I wanted to talk to you about our company because we believe that our integrated approach to projects gets exactly at what Jean's talking about, that yes, the dialogue is about greening existing buildings, and that may be too granular or in the weeds, and I'll be in the weeds today, but we do need to be thinking more broadly, and that's what our company does. We work at high-level policy issues and worked on the green building guidelines post-Katrina, but also more currently are working on a green master plan for the city of Newark. So we're thinking at very high levels. We do also do ground-up development of new green projects, typically mixed income and affordable. And then we also are doing investment in existing buildings. But each of our practice areas bring us closer together, and I think make us better able to see the entire picture that Jean referenced. This is just a, sure, no problem. This is the, just to give you a sense of the range of our expertise, this is a building we just finished for Cooper Union, which is LEED Platinum, designed by Tom Main from Morphosis with a, so this is a new academic building, new lab, to a project we're doing in the Bronx, which is, we won as an international design competition to promulgate a new model for green affordable housing here in New York City. So this is called Via Verde. I mean, the question has been addressed over and over, so it's nice to be with the crowd and have been preceded by so many experts who have contextualized for you why doing green building and reconciling greening of existing buildings and preservation with all the work that we're doing, because buildings represent an amazing impact on the environment and are very contributory to climate change and so on and so forth. So these are some facts that have been established today, but you can see buildings are a big wedge of it. For us, the other critical piece, though, is that talking a lot about the issues that were coming up in the earlier presentations about wetlands and the encroachment of water and where to build or not to build, we have a firm belief that building on existing nodes of mass transit is critical, because green buildings in the middle, that you need to do a lot of commuting to, don't really get you the net environmental benefits that you need. So you can see that if you go after the wedge of carbon that are created by buildings and their energy use as well as transportation, you have a large wedge of carbon emissions that you could be combating. This is, everybody's probably seen this if you're interested in this stuff, but just as part of, this is McKinsey's study which has since been updated, but talks about strategies that have a negative marginal cost of implementation, meaning that you can cost effectively address some of the wedges of carbon. And part of that, those are the strategies that we have for existing buildings and green retrofits. I have two case studies. One is of a commercial office building in downtown Seattle, as was mentioned, and then for a 100% affordable project that's closer to home. And since you've already seen an office project, and we'll see another, I'll go through this more quickly. But this is a project that's right in the heart of Seattle. We were attracted to it because, again, we were driving returns for our investors, but also trying to create a great green product. And we were looking at this project back in 2005 this was early days for a light rail project that has since been built in Seattle, running the light rail right under downtown, right next to bus. And so this building is a block off. This was future at the time in 2006, a future light rail stop, which made it for us a great transit location. But it was also a couple of blocks off some of the best retail and some of the best areas in Seattle from a real estate perspective. And so, but we saw that between Pike Place and Fifth Avenue that there was a lot of development and exciting things happening. This also happens to be across the street from Benaroya Hall, which is, I think, arguably Seattle's version of Carnegie Hall. Walking into the building, though, I mean, the initial impressions were sort of like this. I mean, obviously this picture is terrible, but it gave a sense that this building was very tired and needed upgrade, and had basically been just sort of the tenant improvements were mishmash, and things had been sort of built up over time with no particular plan in place. So we worked with an interdisciplinary team from the get-go. We had Turner Construction, Arup, and then our building managing agent working with us, along with ZGF Architects from Seattle, who helped to put all of this together. One of the things we did was, all our work is grounded in study and analysis, but this was our study for developing what our facade shading and cooling strategy was going to be. This was just a sample from a run that Arup did on the heat gain. But we developed a very simple strategy for the spaces. So taking what you saw earlier and looking at the ways that we could leverage the existing things that were there. And again, this is at that intersection of the preservation and the greening of an existing building. This had great ceiling heights, terrazzo floors that were often covered by old dingy carpets that were dirt gathering, so on and so forth. Operable windows in a 14-story high-rise, which was a great advantage. And then a functioning steam system that was actually hooked up to the district steam in Seattle that was actually building an urban hardwood plant that would be carbon neutral. So we basically used this very simple concept to take the spaces that you saw earlier and create office spaces like this, where you have many of the systems are more exposed. And then throughout the building, our effort was to decommission air conditioning wherever possible and integrate ceiling fans, and then teach tenants to use the double hung windows so that they could bring the lower sashes down and actually get circulation of space. You can see in this photo also light shelves and then the Mecco shades there. And in the very right by their desk, actually, you can see also the building had these amazing wind guards that actually helped bring breezes, so it kept the papers on your desk, but created some great circular flow of air in the spaces. So we transformed the tenant spaces, restored terracotta on the exterior of the building, took corridors that had drop ceilings and felt a little claustrophobic and antiseptic, and tried to integrate some of the green features into the building. Here in this picture, you can see that we ran future conduit down the hallways to address the needs of tenants and for low voltage and otherwise, but also had to, in complying with LEED, come up with some creative ways to enhance the ventilation in the building. And you can see a unit there where we core drilled through the exit wall of the building to actually bring about 300 CFM of additional airflow that's on a carbon monoxide meter to carbon dioxide meter to turn on and off throughout just to enhance the ventilation of the building. We created a bike room in waste space in the basement, But the other thing that we're doing that got at points that were made earlier is that we're also studying what the tenants are doing, because the operations are critical. I mean, it's like passing your PhD exam. The smartest day of your life is, when you finish your quals, but afterwards things are downhill. With the green building, it's the same way. It's great when you get your certification, but then from there on out, if you're not dedicated to continuous improvement, you're in trouble. But one of the things that we do as part of studying our assets and staying in touch with them is actually monitoring what tenants are doing and how they get to work. So this is just a survey sample. The other thing we did was put together a green tenant improvement manual that helped people understand what our mission was with the building, but then how they could enhance and build out their tenant spaces. And that didn't, I guess this is Apple PC kind of issue, but we'll skip over that. Just another page from the tenant manual. But the other thing that we're doing now, which we've implemented subsequent to our certification, was one we had a post-LEED EB Gold certification charrette, where we met with the original design team and said, what else can we do? And amongst the things that came out of that meeting, we're trying to figure out how we can integrate more real-time monitoring in the building and give tenants feedback. Because I think probably all of you have read recently about when you're providing tenants with more information about their energy use, they're actually taking steps themselves to curb their usage. And so we've actually installed real-time meters. In this building, it was very complex because there are a lot of tenants on the same circuits. And so what we were able to do, though, is actually get it down to a floor-by-floor metering, so that we could actually have floors where you have 4, 5, 6 tenants competing against one another to see who can use the least amount of energy. So it'd be really interesting to sort of see how this continues to play out. But right now we're also working with the National Trust of Preservation Green Lab on something which is the next phase of our investments in this building, which was trying at the tenant level really to use all these emerging technologies about smart plugs and otherwise to be able to really monitor things at the tenant level, and then potentially change the way Class B buildings bill and collect rent, because you have gross full service lease structures that I don't need to get into now, but what we want to do is, again, make tenants bear the cost of their utilities, and thereby really try to inform their behavior and activities. This building got its LEED EB Gold. We were top 10 in the Pacific Northwest AIA, and we were privileged to host the launch when Liz Dunn was launching the Preservation Green Lab with the National Trust in Seattle. So the next project I'll also go through relatively quickly is closer to home here for all of you on West 135th Street. This is, as was mentioned, 198 units of 100% affordable Section 8 housing. And arguably, green building and green retrofits are critical to the populations that inhabit low-income housing, and bringing the benefits that you get from improved indoor air quality, lower toxicity, and so on and so forth are really, for residential tenants in low-income, very beneficial. This project, you can see, is very close by, stitched into an amazing neighborhood, though. We won this project through an auction process whereby we were competing with somebody who is trying to take it to market. That the Section 8 contract was expiring. It was being sold by a national REIT that had run it from out of town. And we came in as a preservation buyer and immediately told HUD and the city that our intent was to preserve the affordability long term, but also to green the asset as part of a complete capital retrofit. Just to give you a sense, I mean, the project was originally built around 1905 and subsequently acquired, from what I've understood, by St. Philip's Church that was relocating from the Wall Street area up into this section of Harlem. Was one of the larger acquisitions by African Americans at the time, and actually I think had restrictions against African Americans taking residency in the project prior. You can see there's amazing features to the building, not all that have been preserved, but getting back to it, you can see that this project was gut rehabbed in 1978, and you lost a lot of the amazing architectural details that were there, but we've tried our best to restore them. In going through this, you can see what we found, a sort of mix of conditions, but among them the parapet was degraded, sort of a bunker-like mentality with the management office. Boilers, though, this is 10 contiguous buildings with 10 different boiler plant systems in each, some running as low as 55% efficiency, old deteriorated stacks, and interior corridors that basically just left you not wanting to live there. It's our firm belief as affordable housing developers and mixed income developers that affordable housing doesn't need to be this way and that it doesn't need to make people not want to live there. We found, again, mix of conditions in the unit, and all of this was part of what was a beta project for HUD's Green Retrofit program. Again, we talked to HUD locally and to the city, but also wrote to HUD in DC as they were launching this Green Retrofit program. We were the first to receive money out of the stimulus bill, and the money from that program, the Green Retrofit, effectively doubled our capital budget, what we could do. So we did an intensive study, unit by unit, of all the conditions to figure out what our plan would be. We actually found a couple units where, because of the need to just lease them up and get families in, we were able to just restore them to a workable condition. But our study, you can see these are some of the forms, a deep study throughout, all was culminated in this Green Retrofit Physical Conditions Report that we submitted to HUD to formalize the interdisciplinary approach that we typically take with a project. We do this as a matter of course, but this was formalized for HUD. I mean, I'll skip through some of this stuff, but this again is hard for you to see, but what we did is develop an archetype for what the units will be like. This project is 97, 98% leased right now. So we're working around families to do this retrofit. But we've developed for the vacant units a specification to achieve a sort of height of green, so to speak, and that we will attain as units turn over. There is some stuff that's going on around tenants in terms of lighting, water retrofits, and otherwise, but this will be the full effect when tenants move out of a unit. Some of the green features, again, hard for you to see, but we're just the point of showing you this is that we're thinking about the building as a system. I think you'll hear that heard it from people today, that you need to think about this as an organism that functions, and the inputs on one side have a ramification on others. One of the things that we're doing too, though, is integrating solar PVs to help offset the base building load. And PVs in retrofits are tough to make pay, but we've actually, since we were able to get some subsidized loan monies in to do this, we were able to do a 29 kilowatt array that'll generate about 10% of the base building load. I can move through some of this quickly. One of the things, though, again, is just integrating. This is just a sample on another project, affordable housing project we have in Harlem, where, again, we are showing people about what that array is generating and putting it in the management office so that tenants can come in and see just what impact it has, because it's about that feedback loop. This is our brain damage slide. I mean, this is talking about the sort of the capital stack and the financing it took to get this project to through closing and otherwise. I mean, these projects are highly, when they're subsidized, they are highly complex and lots of capital and people cooperating from the city to other government agencies to make them work. I'll just wrap up by saying that the other thing we're doing, though, with this project to push it forward on the operating side, I mean, we quickly did integrated pest management, quickly did all the green cleaning and training of our managing agent, but we're also part of, we're a beta site for Bright Power. Is a firm developed this thing called energy scorecards. It's a really fascinating tool. They have the largest database in the country of affordable housing that acts a little bit like Energy Star in some ways, in that it's a benchmark tool to benchmark your building's performance against its competitive set. And what's great about this is it's a terrific asset management tool that really gives you a scorecard so that you can see prior to the retrofit we're not an A building right now, but this really boils it down to both energy consumption and carbon, and helps us track as asset managers and owners where we need to take this building, and then post retrofit what else we need to focus on. So hopefully that gives you a taste. I mean, we are continuing this. We have raised successive funds and are doing this nationally, both in the preservation of existing affordable housing, which is a critical need in cities, and then of Class B office, because I think it's been hit home today that there's so much existing stock, and if we can find viable strategies for leveraging private equity and private investment into these buildings, we've got a big challenge on our hands. So thank you guys for your time.
right, well, thank you for having me. Not that you had much of a choice, but you're already here. I purposely, in my presentation, and let me know if I need to speak up, I purposely didn't put a lot of slides dedicated to Passive House specifically. I'm going to really mainly focus the slides on the case study we did. So I'm going to, in 2 minutes, try and sum up what really should take an hour to try and explain about what Passive House is and why I find it so compelling as a system. In short, the Passive House is a low-energy system that was developed in Germany in the 1990s by a Dr. Wolfgang Feist. Basically, he was using data from the locale houses of the Midwest and some other low-energy buildings in Canada from the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s as a base model. And really, he started his research because Germany, the government asked him basically to find a point with energy retrofits that would be financially feasible but would be much a scale factor better than what they were doing currently at the time, which was more around the kind of an Energy Star scale of 20% energy savings. So he was really trying to see, you know, how far can we push this? Can we get it so that the building has, you know, zero energy input with how much cost? Ultimately, in their studies, they realized that wasn't really that feasible. So the standard that we're working with today has just recently come into the United States over the last, from 2003 is the first certified passive house that was done, and now there are about a dozen that have been certified, and a couple dozen in the pipeline to be certified. This project is one of them. The passive house is trying to take the buildings to 90% less heat usage. In this sort of climate zone, in other areas, there's also some passive houses that are being done in Texas and Arizona, and then, you know, obviously they're working at the cooling loads at that aspect. So the beauty of the system really lies in the fact that if you start, there's kind of an exponential curve basically when you're spending money on energy retrofits. It keeps getting more and more costly as you're saving more energy. There ends up being a sweet spot in that curve basically. Once you get to about 90% energy savings, your costs are through the roof at this point, but all of a sudden you can actually drop away a lot of your mechanical systems because your loads have become so small you don't need those systems anymore, or they can be drastically reduced. And most of you who know construction understand that mechanical systems are some of the most costly aspect of the building, whereas insulation and air sealing are some of the least costly aspects of the work, and that's where you're going to get a lot of your load reduction from. So that's Passive House in a nutshell, and I'll be around for lunch so we can kind of talk Passive House in more detail about that. Of course, you know, as you see with this case study, we're going to be kind of having different examples here. So we'll move on from this. So this is a brownstone and park slope. As you can see, it's 4 stories and a cellar. What we're really focusing on is the making the thermal boundary and the air barrier coexist and be in line with each other. That's very important when you're doing the passive house standard or any low energy standard, because basically if the air barrier and the thermal boundary don't coexist, then you actually start to have moisture issues and a lot of building science issues that can cause degrading of the building. We used closed cell spray foam on this building, and we actually had to minimize how much we were going to use. When I first started thinking about this, I was like, oh, you know, we're going to do like the locale buildings, we're going to do, you know, an R50 wall cavity. Well, luckily, doing more research before we actually put the hammer to the building, you realize that actually causes more detrimental effects to the building than not, because you start getting vapor permeability issues, and it actually can cause the building from a freeze-thaw cycle on the brownstone. The bricks can actually start to degrade a little quicker. So we use this closed cell cellulose to be our air barrier and our thermal barrier. In the roof, we use cellulose fill where we could, rather than filling it with the closed cell spray foam. because the cellulose has a much lower embodied energy. So everywhere we could, we tried to minimize the amount of closed cell spray foam because of its high embodied energy. The windows were a big factor that I'll go into in a little bit more, but we kind of used windows from Germany, that company called Optiven. As most of you know, in all around the city, we have a high water table, and so we have the basements are constantly leaking water. Even if you take care of the slab issue and you don't have water coming from the slab, the side walls are always kind of the mortar's crumbling apart and falling in, and a lot of people don't realize that's just the kind of the moisture coming in and breaking apart that mortar. So one of the things that we were concerned about, you know, if you get a building airtight, extremely airtight, then moisture is a super large concern for you. You have to make sure that you're not going to get that water in the building and keep it trapped in the building. So the detail, let's see if I can point this here. So the detail here is showing the front and back wall condition in the cellar. And then we have basically the closed cell spray foam above the slab. And then we pulled the slab away from, we did a new slab, and we pulled the slab away from the wall so that we could actually introduce a new percolating drainage system underneath, I lost my pointer, underneath of the slab with insulation. And then that way any of the water from the hydrostatic pressure pushing on the wall could actually run down the brick and actually get into our percolating system and get away from our foundation and go and be injected into a sump pump. So that's something that we've been doing on all of our projects in the last couple of years, not just the passive house projects. This is kind of a fuzzy image because there's a lot of dust in construction work, so it's hard to get good ones. But basically the image on, on your left is basically my left too. Is basically showing the gravel that we had, and then the guy there is spraying the cellulose, the spray foam insulation right on the stone, and then the next image is showing how we're pouring the concrete right on top of that. So in our walls, we have to, Passive House actually requires, in order to be certified, that you do thermal bridge analysis for any sort of moments that have building connections where you're not going to have continuous insulation or a continuous thermal boundary. So we have basically at each of the areas, this is the front wall or the back wall condition where the joists basically butt right up against the brick on the interior of the building. And so we did our best to use non-standard framing techniques to pull the studs away from the wall and actually get the spray foam to be continuous behind it, and also then around the joist areas to kind of pull the nailers farther away so we get more direct connection of the spray foam. This is a image of the cellar prior to the slab being put in place, but really what I'm focusing on here is the walls. We don't actually have a bottom plate installed in this installation. We actually have the spray foam that kind of wraps up around, and we would put these bracing studs here so that way when the spray foam is expanding, it's not able to push the wall out of alignment. So for the building, this was a landmark district, and so when we went to the Landmarks Commission, we had to show them that we were actually going to maintain this this look of a double hung. And Passive House standard for airtightness is to the degree that you actually can't find a double hung anywhere in the world that's made that would actually have gaskets that are airtight enough for the standard. So we developed a window that basically has, a fixed upper sash, and then we did an interior tilt and turn lower sash. So that way on the exterior of the building, we were able to achieve this shadow line that kind of simulates that double hung look while at the same time meeting our Passive House standard. This is on the interior, so this is not an original window to the house. This was a relatively cheap window retrofit on the top floor that they'd done probably about 20 years ago. And so the new Optivin windows were being installed, and then you can see the tilt and turn on that lower sash coming in. The moldings around the window here, we all had restored. Actually, these didn't exist. We had these made to match the ones that were existing and covered in paint and everything on the lower floor. And the carpenter did a wonderful job actually hand carving the leaf features. We had some original stained glass to the building. So these are all triple pane super insulated windows. This is a tilt and turn casement window that opens the inside. And this window, basically, we had a local maker basically take it and reglaze and re-lead the stained glass, and then we sent it off to Germany. Unfortunately, it's kind of high embodied cost, I know. But we sent it off to Germany, and they installed it in between as the triple pane in this window, and then had the energy efficiency, the argon gas, filled in. So now this window is actually protected by two of the panes, and we think that it's going to have a very long life as a result. So these are just areas where we're highlighting the thermal bridges. It's interesting because when I first presented this project to the Pass West Conference in 2009, I was quickly, like a couple nights before, going through and adding this red line to our drawing, and I realized that, geez, if you always say that when you're doing an air barrier and thermal boundary, you should actually draw it on your plans. Well, I didn't do it until after I was going to present this project, and I realized at the time when we were still in construction in 2009 that I had a couple areas that I'd missed, and so I had to go back and try and figure out how to fix those. And one of the big things too, if you look in the plan view, where you have the corners where the party wall connection, this is an attached townhouse on both sides here and on the back. And so what happens, excuse me, if you just insulate along this face, you're going to get a thermal bypass through the brick to the outside right in those corners. So we had to try and come up with a way to address that. So we created therm models. We also did woofy models for the vapor and moisture questions. These therm models are very informative. They show you basically, this is, let me see if I can get the pointer back. This is our building. This is the neighbor's building where we can't affect. And this is our party wall. This is the exterior. So we were basically saying, okay, well, how far do we need to bring this insulation around in order to make it so that we don't have a significant thermal bridge through the brick? This is, again, a fuzzy construction image of how we're bringing that framing around. And so while we did have a little bit of an aesthetic issue where we have a bump out coming into our house, the client was willing to have that aesthetic sacrifice so that way we could keep those thermal bridges from happening. These are just areas in the air barrier that we were concerned about early in the project. This lower floor was not a full gut, and so we were going to have to try and find out if we were going to have to open up those areas separately. This is an example of me on a cold day with the blower door that we have set up. We have some of the spray foam insulation. We have an infrared camera in my hand there, and what we're doing is we actually brought in a lot of heaters to the house, heated up the house in the wintertime since we didn't have any of the systems in place at that point, and then ran the blower door, which evacuated all the air out of the house. And then what that does is it draws the cold air in through all of the leaks. And then through the infrared camera image, we can actually see kind of the cold spots on the walls, and we use that as a way of kind of correcting where the spray foam was failing in different areas. And then the other image here is the Stogart elastomeric coating that we used, and that's what we used to air seal all of the side party walls because there was a significant air leakage through the party walls. Just another image of the framing and the Stogart and how we overlap the two. So the systems for the house, when you're getting the building that airtight, you have to have natural ventilation. So we have a Zender heat recovery ventilator that we installed in the project. We also, for the heating that didn't cover for our peak load heating, we actually have the Daikin mini split system, which was our heating and cooling for the house. And then we had a solar thermal collector on the roof for our hot water. This is showing the solar thermal is, this is the solar thermal tank. This is basically the solar thermal collection, and then this is a 120-gallon storage tank, and then this is the Zender heat recovery unit with its filters. So one of the great things about this, once you get these brownstone or these passive houses this tight, you then can really control where the air is coming from. You're not dragging the air from in a passive way through all of your walls that have 120-year-old dust in them. You're actually bringing the air in directly where you want it and depositing it where you want it, and it's going through filters that you can change on a regular basis. This is the solar thermal plates on the roof. These are two 4 by 10 foot collectors, and this is expected to do about 70% of the winter load and 100% of the summer load. So some of the challenges, public awareness when we were dealing with Passive House and some of our going through the Landmarks Commission, trying to educate the people that we were talking to on what we're doing and that we're not just blindly creating a project that's going to destroy this house. Obviously they couldn't see the after images where the windows have that nice double hung look, and so they're very skeptical that we were going to create an image of the house that would actually restore it back to the 1880 look. The air barrier is something that's extremely difficult. So the nice thing about Passive House, in talking to clients and prospective clients and other people about it, is that it's very easy to get excited about it and say, oh great, yeah, 90% less, let's do it, and it's not gonna cost that much extra, so let's definitely do it. But then you have the issue of contractors not really knowing how to get us there, and architects and designers we're always trying to stay a step ahead of the clients and the contractors, trying to figure out actually, what are the details that they need to see, so that we don't have a slew of change orders on the job. And so in this project, what's helpful, some of the way that we work on these projects is that we do the construction management as kind of a design build approach. So we kind of are there hand in hand with the contractors on a daily basis, working through those issues. So this is a finished product in the house here. The house didn't have any of the plaster molding you see there. It didn't have the fireplace or any of the moldings there. The only thing that it did have when we came into the house were the moldings that were covered in paint at the front windows there. And those stained glass that you see, the arched windows above, were both also sent to Germany and installed for Landmarks, the requirement on the outside, not embedded in the window. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you for having me here this morning. My name is Stephen Apking, partner with Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. What I want to do this morning is review a little bit of the introduction of SOM in terms of our interest and history in these issues of sustainability, and then focus on a master plan for the inland steel, talking a little bit of the history of that building, but then dealing more specifically with some of our issues of renovating a modern landmark, the development of integrated systems and changes and development that we think need to happen within the manufacturing industry. Talk about the success then of the approach, and then also what we believe is important in terms of the creation of new paradigms in terms of how we all live in our office buildings. We have obviously, as a firm, been very much involved in the development of buildings of the 20th century, so I think it's obvious to many of you all that with that history of building these buildings and really seeing ourselves as a steward of them, that we have very much a history and interest in this area of sustainability. I also think it's important in going back for us looking at mid-century buildings, buildings of the 20th century, that architects always have been interested in issues of sustainability and being very thoughtful problem solvers. So here are some examples that were done by our firm, but again, there are many other examples from other architects and working around the world. This project in Jeddah being very thoughtful about shielding all of the windows from direct sunlight, using natural ventilation in projects. This is an airport terminal that we did for the Hajj in Jeddah in the 1970s. And then for us, another, I think, instrumental project which was done in the 70s for Weyerhaeuser, doing all open plan, lots of access to natural light, very deep overheads to protect from the sun, and green roofs. So modern architects in many ways have always been interested in these issues. We also are looking at new buildings around the world. This is an example of a building that we're doing in China, where we're really looking at very high performance buildings really as entire products. And so for us, it's not only important to look at the past, but also to make sure that we're looking at everything in terms of new technologies in the future, how we can bring those back to buildings that we are renovating. It's also important, I believe, that we have a direct connection with the world of academics. So within our own firm, we have a direct connection with Rensselaer Polytechnique, an effort that we call CASE, which is located within our office. So we have 20 students that are actually involved in research with us for new products, which has been very instrumental in our effort. This is a brief introduction of projects that we have been involved in terms of renovating 20th century buildings. I think perhaps the one that might be most known to everyone here, located in New York, is the work that we did at Lever House, working very closely with Landmarks on the installation of a whole new curtain wall, lots of new energy improvements in terms of that curtain wall, all looking very closely at the historic details and dimensions of that curtain wall. Then I do want to talk about the building Inland Steel. Inland Steel is a building that was built by our firm right after the war. It's the first major building that was built in downtown Chicago. I will also say that there were a lot of things about this building that were very much about innovation. And so the building itself had a separate service corridor that separated the service functions from the glass office block itself, column-free environment with the columns on the outside. There was a double glazed window system at this time. There was an in-floor deck system. So for us coming back and revisiting this building, there were lots of things that we discovered that were inherent in this building that made issues of sustainability more understandable in terms of how to insert the photographs then of the existing building. What I will say as I start to talk about our work on this project today, this building was bought by a client, Richard Cohen, with Capital Properties. He lives here in New York. He purchased this building at the recommendation of his best friend, Frank Gehry. And Frank talks very lovingly about being a young architect and admiring this building, looking at its stainless steel facade, appreciating the sort of new technologies and an almost handmade quality from the exterior of the building, and convinced his friend that this was a building that was worth saving. These are some of the original photographs. This is actually SOM's office within this building in the 1960s. And then again, beginning this project, working with our clients. And as you can imagine, we had huge advocates of innovation. And so our mission here was really to not only restore this building, but to really see its mission, his historic mission of being a building about innovation, and how could we look at sustainability, performance of a building, and bring all of those attributes to this building in a real living way. So we went through the building and developed a master plan of many things that we could bring into play here. A lot of them were, again, using the technologies and infrastructure that existed within the building, all the new things that we were doing in buildings around the world that might find a place here, including chill beam systems and new technologies in terms of air and water retention and so forth. So some of the things we looked at for the renovation were at the lower level of the plaza. We looked at the plaza itself in terms of how we could have reclaimed heating sources to melt the snow, how we could recapture that water, how we could layer in new planted walls and so forth. We developed a strategy of green walls that could be located in the sort of the pocket park in between the main block of the building, smaller annex behind. We also were working with manufacturers on new technology for street lighting, how we could bring in new technologies for LED and really sort of let this building be seen as sort of a real sort of player in terms of new ideas that could be displayed. We also looked at more sort of prosaic things in terms of how we could be thoughtful with water in terms of our washrooms and so forth, which were simply a part of this. Also, too, green roofs. We have a green roof several levels of this building at the annex and also at the top of the building with all of the performative measures that have already been discussed by several of the panelists here. One of the other fascinating things of going back and visiting these buildings is that there was a lot of space that was dedicated to outmoded technology. Some of the sort of large overriding building systems in terms of central air facilities, we could reclaim. There were a lot of old technologies of big telephone rooms that had already been cleared for us. So I think in looking at mid-century buildings, there's a lot of area that we can find that we can add into the sort of rentable and usable area of these buildings. And then the development not only of the building on the exterior, but also the interior with a high-performance integrated environment that included lighting, air conditioning, new modular office walls, and furniture. Then I'd like to talk briefly about several of the issues we've been dealing with in terms of working on landmarks and renovating this building. One of the key ones is really dealing with the curtain wall. There were a series of options that we looked at. One which was looking at the exterior wall and replacing its glazing. As I mentioned, already had double glazing. How could we bring in new technology of triple glazing, replace all the seals? Another one that we also looked at that I think was particularly interesting was leaving all of that existing fabric in place and installing a new third wall behind that, several inches behind, that would create almost the value of a thermos in terms of mediating the extreme temperature outside and inside, which we find is particularly applicable in cities like Chicago. We have wild swings between the heat and the winter, and then including within that cavity a louver system, a vertical louver system that was a part of the original design of the building that all could be connected with sensors to the sun, looking at the different facades and how that might in fact be implemented. We also have dealt with a whole series of ADA issues. I think that while we all can see there's been lots of dialogue between designers and people interested in preservation and landmarks accommodating ADA requirements. I don't think that any of us would think that buildings that we're preserving should in no way not accommodate the highest degree of accessibility. I think that in the near future we will also see that we cannot foresee a building that's being renovated that cannot also accommodate the highest degree of sustainability. So here are issues in terms of keeping the existing drum, how we can insert new sliding doors and technology that allow for accessibility. We also did a lot of work in terms of lighting of the building at the lowest level. We were able to go back and reinstall these very large square luminous fixtures that had been taken out. We're looking now at the benefit of new technologies in terms of neon, in terms of LED, higher energy efficient fluorescence. So once again, we can have this kind of lighting in our buildings and it can in fact be sustainable. We also looked at this with luminous ceilings at the lobby level. And historically, obviously, these have all been very, very low and very high in terms of their energy conservation. So usage, so we want to look at how, in fact, we can maintain these. The next thing I'd like to talk about is an integrated system. And what we very clearly understood is that if we wanted to achieve this highest degree of sustainability, that we really were looking at fully integrated systems, that it was not about just parts and pieces. So we looked at an example here in this image of how we could have a fully integrated system that accommodated not only lighting, but the delivery of air systems, the vertical blinds on the window walls, and so forth. and have found really challenge in working with manufacturers today. There certainly are many, many manufacturers out there that are looking at how they can increase the sustainability and thoughtfulness of their own products, but they are really not at all working at how these all come together. So in many ways, when you're working on a building, bringing in these new technologies, you tend to sort of see this developing as the Frankenstein monster of all of these pieces being cobbled together, but not really fully integrated. So as a part of this, we brought together manufacturers, particularly with the use of the ceiling. So we brought in ceiling manufacturers Armstrong and Ceiling Plus. We brought in lighting engineers from Philips, as well as the chilled duct ceiling systems, developed a metal membrane ceiling system that would sort of support and conceal all of these issues. Here's some drawings of the ceiling, the sort of membrane modular system that we designed that included all of these integrated well together. Also looking at modular wall systems that could clip into this, working with Unifor in terms of the higher performance of wall systems, how we can in fact have air integrated and delivered at the desk surface or within the walls themselves, and the development of a furniture system that would clip into this. In terms of talking about these issues with our clients, we found it's important to come up with an easy, natural way of talking about this in terms of how we can talk about things that are easier to accommodate or accomplish in terms of just practice, things that are lower cost, things that have a payback over a shorter period of time, and then ones that require obviously more time in terms of payback. So there are sort of levels that we call levels of green that certainly take into consideration LEED and other measures of sustainability. For this particular project, we looked at all of those. The ones here with stars are ones that are included in the master plan in terms of behavioral change. Those that require a little bit more thoughtfulness in terms of sensors and so forth. Other ones in terms of more integrated vegetation within the roof, reclaiming water, the double wall facade system, those that got us up toward LEED Platinum, and then ultimately looking a little bit for this building in terms of things, in terms of generating energy that we could do within this building, but we're looking at increasing this in terms of what we can do with future renovations as well. So this was then a chart that we used in discussing these items in terms of the energy consumption of this building and how by adapting these multiple measures we could radically reduce that. What I would also say with this, we're seeing it's increasingly important to deal with owners of buildings to talk more in long term. We find that certainly within institutional clients, the GSA, others and so forth, this is an easier thing. We find talking with our clients in Asia or in Europe, they also think about building in long-term investments. That certainly is not the case here within the States in terms of building owners or developers. The net result of this master plan is we have a triple LEED Platinum. These are our scorecards in terms of the continued measurement of this as this project is then implemented. The last thing I'd like to talk about is creating a new paradigm. And I think that one of the things we certainly see within the marketplace is you rent out new office floors, and the first thing you do is you rip everything out and throw it all away. So we want to see how, in fact, we can change the idea within the marketplace that, in fact, you buy into a building, that you find value in that building. I also think that if there are a lot of clients out there that do want to be thoughtful in these arenas, maybe we as architects and building owners need to give them the tools that they need to actually live this way. This, I think, is a little bit easier when you have a building owner who actually is going to occupy their building. I think the challenge here for us is how could we do this for a multi-tenant building where an owner would be leasing this out. So part of it was looking at these systems and looking at how it could accommodate multiple workplace models that could be shown to a client. We also looked at the covering of these systems and how they also could be sustainable. I have to say, in looking at our materials while we were looking at forested woods and so forth, we did not want to try to replicate sort of an old mahogany kind of world, but we wanted to talk about a new way of looking at sustainability where it was not sort of brown and grungy, but was something that could be sort of joyful and sort of cheerful and coming up with new ideas about living in sustainable, healthy environments. In some ways, working in this building, signing up for this building in our mind was a little bit like buying a car that you would buy into a product, could customize certain features of it. All of these products were reusable. All of this was, example, like the carpet tile, where in fact it could be resent and recolored and then brought back to the site. There was also a degree of service that was in this building in terms of moving into this office hotel. The idea is that you would move into this product, and there were lots of things that would be provided to you in terms of services, concierge service. We find that this is something that is increasingly marketable in other parts of the world, primarily in the Middle East, India, China, where our clients find it advantageous to move into buildings and not have to start from scratch themselves. In the sort of refound areas of this building, the back annex, turning that into an amenities building for the office hotel that included large meeting rooms, reception rooms, dining rooms, and so forth. Then trying to then educate the marketplace in terms of how this might be sold, in terms of not only issues of sustainability, but other things that are advantageous in terms of their workplace, moving into a smarter, more work environment, the sort of the marketing and the selling of that. So that's my comments then for this morning. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was quite informative and varied and as interesting as I had hoped. And Lisa informs me that we're running a little late, so we'll limit our questions. I have one question that came out of this morning's discussions, where the consumption of natural resources and the impact on the waste stream from demolition in projects. And I wondered, of course, we're dealing with existing buildings here, but to what extent was that really a positive component of this project in terms of, you know, did we rip out 1,000 windows and replace them with new windows, and the reasoning behind that? There was a bit of irony about restoring the stained glass and sending it to Germany to be, and back and just sometimes in meeting the specifics of often even what's LEED or passive requirements. Is it a viable approach, or are we having impacts in other ways that we should be thinking about? And open question.
I mean, I guess I would just point out, I didn't mention, I think with the Vance project in Seattle, we actually were able to restore the existing wood windows, so we looked at a number of opportunities for replacing, putting in new glazing on the building, and ultimately decided that based on the modeling Arab did, that with the proper shading strategies and weather stripping, that we could restore what was there, and so it was a great preservation win. I mean, I think, but there is a tension. I mean, it's something we looked really seriously at, trying to enhance the thermal performance of the building by replacing the windows, and ultimately came down on the side of being able to restore, but that it was really Seattle's temperate climate, the existing conditions that enabled us, not universally applicable by now.
Construction waste is one of those interesting things. It's not actually very well documented, and it's Massachusetts, I believe, is the first state in the country that doesn't allow commercial construction waste to go into landfill, and it has spawned a tremendous surge in companies that reclaim and recycle waste and manage the waste that's coming out of your building. And the test studies on this actually, even before these were in place, showed that you could actually, the contractor could save money by having managed construction waste rather than paying the tipping fees. But there are certain ironies in it. We had a very high reclamation rate in the McCormick. We did replace the windows. They were 70-year-old unanodized single-pane windows. They would have been hard to repair. We did propose interior storms, which turned out to be more expensive and were not favored by the maintenance crew. The ironies are, of course, that the new aluminum windows have insulated glass units, which we believe will start to fail at a certain percentage rate and create a maintenance problem over the next 50 years. And the windows that were recycled, that's complete misuse of the term. They were taken out of the building, the aluminum was stripped and shipped to Japan, where most of the recycling plants are, and the glass, of course, becomes downcycled. And so I always ask, exactly how much glass can we create in this world before we have to think elsewhere about what we're doing with our glass?
I would also say that the buildings that we're all working in are living organisms, and I think that the materials are constantly coming and going from our buildings. I know that with Inland Steel, it's not as though when we revisited that building that all of the existing fabric was there. I mean, over the years, glazing had broken, it had to be replaced, sealants had to be replaced, a new technology was coming in and out of the building. I think for me, the important thing is what do we do from here on? Mm-hmm. And I think that what we have to understand is that in the life of these buildings, we have to prepare them for sort of a better future in terms of sort of stopping the cycle of constantly pulling out and pulling in new.
We searched long and hard for a biodiesel boat to ship out the windows. But no, in defense of the windows, and one of the things when you have a client that's pushing the envelope so far, and they've specifically bought this house because of the neighborhood and the beauty of it, if they have a couple amenities that might seem a little extravagant, also the things that are required by landmarks to maintain. We felt that it was a small price to pay, as well as the durability that we were going to gain, especially from the window in the bathroom that was going to actually have that leaded glass protected within the triple panes. We felt that that would really extend the life of that glazing and keep it from doing what most of them do after 20, 40 years, and they start to kind of collapse and need to be redone. And then the windows, the stained glass windows in the front, landmarks wanted those to be specifically on the outside, but we didn't feel that the local contractors installing that kind of separately was going to be as durable as having the window manufacturer themselves. So my hope is that within a couple years, we're actually the passive house we're working on now, also in Park Slope, is under construction. A new one we're actually using windows from the Midwest, so we're getting a little closer.
Good.
And
hopefully as time goes on.
Exactly. The purple door is actually existing, and the door itself has not been reworked and regasketed yet, but it's going to be black with the rest of the. I should have photoshopped that, knowing who I was coming to see.
Hey, Roz.
I'm not at liberty to tell you the dollar figures, but I would say that when we did a detailed analysis of the cost for the total construction versus what the passive house standard kind of increased the cost, it ended up being only 2.7% more for the passive house standard versus a standard construction, which in terms of the client's payback, it's going to pay back in 5 to 6 years for them, and with almost a $4,000 savings per year in energy usage. And we're doing extensive data monitoring for the next 2 years minimum to have testing in all the different rooms so that we can try and prove what we're saying now and not just kind of walk away from it and get to claim these savings.
There's a lot of questions, so I'm going to just help manage them. Yes, you with the green jacket, sir? Just if I could repeat the question so everybody could hear. I think the question is whether the LPC might consider changing or relaxing their standards to better accommodate green building materials and standards.
You're really trying to get me crucified in this room. No, I mean, I would say that the one of the great synergies that we had with the Passive House standard in this project was that even though these windows that were required by the landmarks were incredibly costly, because of the high energy savings that these windows are providing, since most people don't know U values, the R value kind of equivalent of this window is around an R 8.5. So because that kind of allowed us to not have local convective flows, and so we could remove the radiators that are underneath of the windows and change the system and really drastically change the size of the system, the client was able to afford those extremely expensive windows. Hopefully, within a couple of years, we'll have the local windows that will still be expensive, but they won't be that much. So it's a little bit of a dodge.
I'd like to add that I think we have to be careful about the concept of one ideal trumping another ideal, and that we have to come up with new technologies and new materials and ways to respond to this effectively. And that we really have, that's the whole point of this conference, that we need to work together to come up with solutions that effectively meet both those goals.
Without the beauty and the character of that house, my client would have never bought it, and then the project wouldn't have happened. So.
Right.
Yes, Aaron?
The spray foam insulation?
So repeat, where was the insulation installed and how will that impact the durability of the bricks in the building?
It was installed directly to the brick. We kept it to a minimum of the 3 inches because of vapor permeability based on the material specs. And spray foam is relatively elastic. It can move with the brick. However, right after it's sprayed, almost at there's a little bit of a separation from the surface, basically within the first 30 days of drying, which is why we were able to actually, for that cellar detail, rely on the water to come in, and that while the bulk moisture won't pass through the insulation, there's a slight separation between the two that will allow it to run down through that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Jean Tadji. Okay, go ahead.
Well, it is actually quite interesting. There have been a couple of studies, I think McKinsey may be the one I'm thinking of, that has recently shown that the direct payback to owners is quite specific and can be, many of the things, for instance, that the Empire State Building are doing have a 2, 3, 4-year payback and fund future things. And I think the statistic I saw was that fewer than 30% of building owners and fewer than 20% of tenant groups are actually taking advantage of some very, very easy things that reduce, in particular, energy use intensity, like just having a regular program of taking care of your steam traps or cleaning your filters, which can contribute to 10% of an energy use. So I don't quite know. I was sort of counting on Randy Mason to explain later today why this isn't so obvious and why the information isn't out there, because I see it everywhere. And BOMA's trying to get it out, and Rocky Mountain Institute's trying to get it out, and we're trying to get it out through building codes. So I don't get it. So.
I would also say that I find a lot of it has to come from leadership from the design team. I think that when clients come to us with projects, we have to be the ones who oftentimes initiate these ideas. We have to make it understandable to them. We have to make it tangible. We are working with a number of clients on master planning of big corporate campuses, 2 of them here in New York. And one of the things that we did that is sort of new to us is we said we're going to look at this master plan over the next 25 years. So this is not something that they came to us for. They really wanted to look at a sort of maybe a 5-year plan, but we said, no, let's look at the 5-year and let's look at the 25-year plan. So I think that's just one example, but I think it's for the people here in this room to make this all understandable and acceptable.
I mean, I just would add that I think as a building owner, there are a number of other owners that just don't have the ability to do and direct a process like this, because it does take knowledge. I mean, there's a tremendous capital gap that exists with PACE financing sort of on life support or dead. There aren't the financial vehicles sometimes to have enlightened owners be able to bring private equity to bear to do it, and then there's just the knowledge and coordination gap that exists. And so, I mean, you have a pretty special set of people that know how to do these things and manage the process well. But I mean, you also see the resistance Bloomberg got in trying to push the real estate industry to accept more scrutiny. I mean, as an owner here, I mean, I think we're sort of interested to embrace it. And I mean, I think you will see more continued pressure from municipalities and cities on, and there's some promise in what's happening here in New York City next year with energy audits and things like that. It's a slow process, but it's just this coordination problem within an asset itself, but then amongst owners who have very different interests. Government really has to play a strong role.
Thank you. Lisa, do we have time for any more questions?
We could do one more, but we all have to get back here at the same time for lunch. So it just takes a little bit time away from lunch, but let's have one more. In the blue jacket, sir?
Yes. You mentioned the restoration of terracotta, and that was tried at the Wilson building with concrete tiles that turned plastic and disintegrated faster than the terracotta. I'm wondering what you're going to do with the restoration.
Well, we were basically actually, the building had an existing terracotta skin on it, and so we were restoring, had to fabricate and then restore some terracotta tiles that were fashioned to meet the standards of the building as it existed, and it was actually on a small patch. The challenge in a high seismic zone like Seattle is that some of the terracotta system and the lattice work had sort of degraded based on water damage between the terracotta and the concrete exterior wall, and so it was sagging and causing cracking throughout. So we had to do an entire facade sort of restoration, shore up some of the terracotta pieces and try to keep the building facade from sagging. But I mean, again, this was something that we were trying to keep the existing system and preserve as much as possible, and I can't really expound on sort of the benefits of it or not. I mean, I think Seattle has a great tradition of terracotta buildings, and so for us it was a pretty easy decision to follow through with that preservation. Sorry if that doesn't quite address your question, but.
Any last words, Judith?
Well, I just wanted to thank our panelists. I think they did a great job and most appreciated, and I'm sure the conversation will continue through lunch and this evening. Thank you.
Just a few housekeeping announcements. If you are here for AIA or APA credits, and there are a lot of them offered today, the sign-in is now at the registration desk, and it will remain there throughout the afternoon, so just be sure to sign your name. Please return back here at 1:30. You can pick up a box lunch outside, but then you can also take it to Buell, and you'll see that there is a map in your program that shows where Buell is. There's going to be additional seating there, or you can sit at the cafe tables out here, or you're welcome to stay in this cold room. We are still trying to fix the air temperature in here. I apologize, it's so chilly. Let's see. Okay. You are the last one. I'm glad that you're going to sharing how to solve all the problems.
Yeah, great. The second from the bottom. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, the wrong one. This.
This one?
Mm-hmm.
And you're going in the next panel, right?
No, in the very last.
Oh,
the
okay.
second to last session.